Hey, Morty! We just jumped into Dreamverse!
Rick never meant to become the kind of person who could bend reality with his fingertips, but some gifts arrive wrapped in the strangest paper. It started the night he discovered that sadness, when held just right, could actually stretch time itself, not forward or backward, but sideways into the soft places between one heartbeat and the next. He was 7 years old, sitting in his grandmother's garden, watching her water the tomatoes with tears she thought no one could see. That's when he first felt it, the gentle pull at the edges of everything, like the world was made of warm taffy. And if he was very careful, very quiet, he could stretch just a little more room for love to fit. We truly love and care for you wherever you are tonight. Before we begin Rick's story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now, grab your coffee, tea, or whatever brings you comfort, and let's get started. The tomatoes were dying, and Grandma Rose was pretending they weren't. Rick could tell because she kept humming that old song about sunshine and rainbows, while her shoulders shook just a little with each note. 7-year-old Rick had learned to read the spaces between words, the pauses between breaths, the way grown-ups held their faces when they thought children weren't watching. He sat cross-legged on the warm brick pathway, still in his grass-stained baseball uniform from Little League practice, watching her tend to plants that had already made their peace with autumn. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke and the particular sadness that comes when summer finally admits it's over. His mom was inside, arguing with someone on the phone about medical bills and insurance claims, and other adult mysteries that made her voice sound thin and tired. Grandma Rose had been living with them for 3 months now, ever since she started forgetting things. Not big things, not yet, just the edges of memories like photographs left too long in sunlight. She'd forget where she put her reading glasses while they sat perched on her head, or call Rick by his father's name, then catch herself with a little laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. But she never forgot the garden. Even when she couldn't remember what she'd eaten for breakfast or which day of the week it was, her hands knew exactly how to cup a dying tomato plant, how to whisper the right encouragements to stubborn roses, how to coax life from soil that seemed ready to give up. The secret, she'd told Rick earlier that summer, when the garden was still drunk on sunshine and possibility, is knowing when to hold on and when to let go. Plants are a lot like people that way. Sometimes they need you to fight for them, and sometimes they need you to love them enough to say goodbye. Rick hadn't understood then. He was 7, and 7-year-olds believe in forever the way they believe in birthday wishes and tooth fairies, completely, desperately, without reservation. Death was something that happened to Goldfish and the batteries in his Game Boy, not to the people who made chocolate chip cookies appear when you were sad, and who knew all the words to songs from before you were born. But tonight, watching her water plants that would be brown and brittle by morning, Rick felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't quite sadness, and it wasn't quite fear. It was something gentler and more complicated, like the feeling you get when you realize you've been holding your breath without meaning to. That's when it happened. Grandma Rose bent to examine a particularly droopy tomato plant, and as she did, a single tear slipped down her cheek and caught the porch light like a tiny falling star. Rick wanted to reach out and catch it, to hold it safe somehow, to make the moment last long enough for him to figure out what he was supposed to do, with all the love that was suddenly too big for his 7-year-old body to contain. And then, without knowing how or why, he did. The tear seemed to hang in the air, suspended like a droplet of honey, while the world around them grew soft and elastic. The cricket song stretched into long, low notes. The breeze that had been rustling the maple leaves slowed to a gentle whisper. Even the distant sound of his mother's worried voice from inside the house seemed to settle into a rhythm as slow and steady as a lullaby. Rick could feel something warm and strange flowing through his fingers, like he was holding invisible thread. That connected him to everything around them, to Grandma Rose, to the dying garden, to the golden light spilling from the kitchen window, to the vast October sky dotted with early stars. It was as if the universe had paused just for a moment to make room for something important. In that stretched-out space between seconds, Rick understood something he wouldn't have words for until years later. That love isn't just a feeling, it's a kind of time travel. It lets you hold on to moments that want to slip away, stretch them out like taffy, make them big enough to live inside for as long as you need to. Grandma Rose straightened slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her gardening glove, and something in her face had changed. Not the sadness. That would always be there now, Rick somehow knew, but something else. A kind of peace, maybe, or acceptance, as if she'd felt him there with her in that impossible moment, sharing the weight of goodbye. "Rick, honey," she said, her voice soft as morning fog, "come help me bring the last of these tomatoes inside. I think it's time to make one more batch of sauce before the frost comes." The moment snapped back to normal speed, like a rubber band releasing, and Rick stumbled slightly as the world resumed its proper pace. But something had changed inside. Him too. Something he could feel humming quietly in his chest, like a song he'd always known but never heard before. He got to his feet and walked over to where his grandmother stood among the dying plants, her arms full of green tomatoes that would never quite ripen. When he took half the load from her, their fingers brushed, and for just an instant, Rick could swear he felt the echo of that strange, soft time still clinging to her skin like morning dew. "Grandma?" he said as they walked toward the house together. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think the tomatoes know we love them, even when they have to go?" She stopped walking for a moment and looked down at him with eyes that seemed to hold all the October twilight in their depths. "Oh, Rick," she said, and her voice was full of something that might have been wonder. "I think everything knows when it's loved. That's the most important thing there is to know." They stood there in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the gentle ghosts of summer, and Rick felt that warm, strange feeling in his chest grow a little stronger. He didn't know yet that he'd just discovered something extraordinary about himself, something that would shape every relationship he'd ever have and every choice he'd ever make. He just knew that this moment, this exact configuration of love and loss and October air, was something worth holding on to. And somehow, impossibly, he was already learning how, inside the house, his mother had finished her phone call and was starting dinner. The kitchen windows glowed with warm yellow light, and the smell of onions sautéing drifted out to meet them. Grandma Rose squeezed Rick's shoulder gently as they climbed the porch steps together. "You're going to be something special, Rick," she said quietly. "I can feel it in my bones. You've got the kind of heart that makes the world a little bit bigger just by being in it." Rick didn't fully understand what she meant, but he filed the words away in the part of his mind where he kept all the important things: his father's last voicemail before the accident, the sound of his baby brother's first laugh, the way chocolate chip cookies smelled when they were perfectly done. Someday, he sensed, he'd need to remember this moment exactly as it happened. That night, after the green tomatoes had been turned into the last batch of Rose's famous sauce, after the dishes were washed and the garden tools put away, after Grandma Rose had told him 3 stories and sung 2 lullabies, Rick lay in his bed staring out at the stars and flexing his fingers experimentally. The strange feeling was still there, humming quietly under his skin like electricity, running through very small wires. When he concentrated, he could almost feel the edges of things, the boundary between his bedroom and the hallway, between tonight and tomorrow, between the person he was and the person he was becoming. He fell asleep that night with one hand stretched toward the window, as if he were trying to touch the space between the stars. And in his dreams, he was walking through a garden where nothing ever died, where every moment lasted exactly as long as it needed to, where love was a golden thread connecting everything to everything else in an endless, gentle web. When he woke up the next morning, the first frost had come, just as Grandma Rose had predicted. But instead of feeling sad about the end of summer, Rick felt something else entirely, a quiet excitement. Like standing at the edge of a vast ocean, he was finally old enough to swim in. He was 7 years old and he had just learned to stretch time. But more importantly, he had learned that some gifts are meant to be shared, and that the most powerful magic is often the gentlest kind. The tomatoes were gone, but the love remained, and somehow that felt like the most important thing of all. By the time Rick turned 9, he had begun to understand that his gift worked like breathing, natural when you weren't thinking about it, impossible when you tried too hard. He'd spent the better part of 2 years attempting to recreate that October evening in Grandma Rose's garden, stretching his fingers toward moments that stubbornly refused to slow down, concentrating so fiercely on the spaces between seconds that he gave himself headaches. It wasn't until Tommy Breslin pushed Emma Martinez off the monkey bars during recess that Rick learned his ability had less to do with time and more to do with the peculiar physics of feeling. Emma hit the playground mulch with a soft thud and immediately began to cry, not the dramatic, attention-seeking wails that some kids specialized in, but the quiet, hiccuping sobs of genuine hurt. She clutched her skinned elbow against her chest while Tommy stood over her, red-faced and defensive, insisting it was an accident, even though everyone had seen him do it on purpose. Rick was halfway across the playground when it happened again, that familiar warm pull in his chest, like someone was gently tugging on invisible strings connected to his heart. The autumn air seemed to thicken around them, and suddenly everyone's movements became slow and honey-smooth. Mrs. Patterson, who had been hurrying over from the basketball court, now appeared to be walking through invisible molasses. The other children's voices dropped to a low underwater murmur, but Emma's tears still fell at normal speed, and her pain remained sharp and immediate. Rick realized with the peculiar clarity that sometimes comes to 9-year-olds that he wasn't slowing down time at all. He was stretching space, making room in the world for feelings that were too big to fit in regular-sized moments. He knelt beside Emma in that expanded pocket of reality and, without really knowing why, placed his small hand on her uninjured arm. Immediately he could feel what she was feeling, not just the physical sting of her scraped elbow, but the deeper hurt of being pushed by someone she'd thought was her friend, the embarrassment of falling in front of everyone, the confusion that comes when the world suddenly proves less safe than you'd believed it to be. "It's okay," Rick whispered, and his voice seemed to echo strangely in the stretched-out space around them. "I can feel how much it hurts. All of it." Emma looked up at him with eyes still blurred by tears, but her sobbing gradually quieted. There was something in Rick's face, a depth of understanding that seemed impossible in someone so young, that made her feel less alone with her pain. "Tommy didn't mean it," she said, though they both knew that wasn't quite true. "Maybe not," Rick replied gently, "but it still hurt, and that's what matters right now." He helped her to her feet, and as he did, he felt the strange, warm energy flowing through him again. This time, instead of trying to hold on to the moment, he let it settle around Emma like a soft blanket, cushioning her hurt until she could carry it more easily. The world snapped back to normal speed, just as Mrs. Patterson reached them, but something fundamental had shifted. Emma's tears had stopped, and while her elbow was still scraped, she no longer looked like a little girl whose world had just proven itself unreliable. Instead, she looked like someone who had been reminded that kindness existed, even in playground conflicts. "What happened here?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her teacher instincts immediately cataloguing the scene. One crying child, one guilty-looking boy, one 9-year-old who somehow seemed older than his years. "I fell," Emma said simply, "but Rick helped me up." Tommy, who had been preparing an elaborate defense involving his shoelaces and the laws of physics, looked confused by this unexpected mercy. Rick met his eyes with a steady gaze that held no accusation, only a kind of patient understanding that made Tommy's shoulders relax despite himself. "Accidents happen," Rick said quietly. "Right, Tommy?" Tommy nodded eagerly, grateful for the lifeline. "Right, I'm sorry, Emma, are you okay?" And the strange thing was she was okay. Not just physically, but in some deeper way that Rick couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. The hurt was still there, but it had transformed into something more manageable. A small sadness instead of a devastating betrayal. A temporary sting instead of a permanent scar. Mrs. Patterson cleaned Emma's scrape, with the efficiency of someone who had bandaged thousands of playground injuries, but Rick noticed that she kept glancing at him with a puzzled expression. There was something different about the way the situation had resolved itself, something that didn't quite follow the usual pattern of childhood drama. Later that afternoon, as Rick sat in his favorite spot under the old oak tree at the edge of the playground, he tried to make sense of what had happened. He flexed his fingers experimentally, the way he had that night in Grandma Rose's garden, but nothing unusual occurred. The October breeze continued at its normal pace, the leaves fell at their appointed speed, and time flowed forward in its customary, unremarkable way. It was only when he noticed Sarah Chen sitting alone on the bench near the school building, looking small and lost with a crumpled test paper in her hands, that Rick felt the familiar tug in his chest again. This time he didn't fight it or try to control it. Instead, he simply walked over and sat beside her, letting that warm, strange energy pool around them both like sunlight through water. "Math test?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "I studied so hard, but I still got a D-. My parents are going to be so disappointed." Rick could feel the weight of her worries settling around them like fog, thick and suffocating. Without thinking, he reached out with that invisible part of himself and began to stretch the space around her fear, making it less dense, less overwhelming. "What if," he said slowly, "they're not disappointed in you, but disappointed for you? Like they're sad that something you worked hard for didn't turn out the way you wanted?" Sarah considered this, and Rick could feel her anxiety beginning to shift and settle into something more manageable. "You think?" "My mom gets disappointed for me all the time," Rick said. "Like when I really want to make the basketball team but I'm too short, or when I study for a spelling test and still mess up necessary. She's not mad at me for being short or for struggling with spelling. She's just sad that the world doesn't always cooperate with what we want." The truth was, Rick didn't actually struggle with spelling. He was one of the best students in his grade. But he could feel that Sarah needed to hear about struggle that made sense, struggle that wasn't a reflection of her worth as a person. So he offered her his fictional difficulties like a gift, wrapped in understanding. They sat together in that expanded moment while the rest of the school day swirled around them at half speed, and Rick learned something important about his gift. It wasn't really about time at all. It was about creating space for feelings to exist without being rushed, judged, or minimized. It was about making room in the world for the full spectrum of human experience to unfold at its own pace. "You know what's weird about you, Rick?" Sarah said after a while, her voice steadier now. "What?" "When you listen, it feels like you're really listening. Like with your whole self. Most people are just waiting for their turn to talk." Rick smiled, though he felt a little flutter of something that might have been loneliness. It was nice to be understood, but it also made him realize how different he was from other kids his age. They lived in a world where moments happened at regular speed, where feelings came and went, without requiring extra space to exist properly. They didn't carry around this strange ability to stretch the emotional, physics of any situation they encountered. "Thanks," he said simply. Sarah folded up her test, paper, and tucked it into her backpack with something that looked like resolution rather than defeat. "I'm going to ask Mrs. Rodriguez if I can retake it," she said. "The worst thing she can say is no, right?" "Right," Rick agreed, though he suspected Mrs. Rodriguez would say yes. There was something about Sarah's face now, a quiet determination. That hadn't been there before. That suggested she would find a way to make things work out. As they walked back toward the school building together, Rick reflected on the strange pattern his life seemed to be taking. He was 9 years old, and he was already becoming the kind of person other people sought out when they needed someone to sit with them in their difficult moments. He wasn't sure how he felt about that responsibility, but he couldn't deny that it felt important somehow. Like he'd been given this gift for a reason he was only beginning to understand. That night at dinner, his mother asked him about his day with the kind of careful attention she'd been paying to him ever since Grandma Rose had moved to the memory care facility 6 months earlier. Rick knew she was worried about him, about whether he was handling all the changes in their family with the resilience she hoped for. "It was good," he said, pushing his mashed potatoes around on his plate. "I helped Emma Martinez when she got hurt at recess, and I talked to Sarah Chen about her math test." His mother smiled, but there was something wistful in her expression. "You're always helping other people, aren't you?" "That's a beautiful thing, Rick, but I want you to know it's okay to need help sometimes too." Rick nodded, though he wasn't sure how to explain that helping others didn't feel like a choice exactly. It was more like having really good hearing. When someone was in pain, he couldn't help but notice it, and once he noticed it, ignoring it felt impossible. "I know, Mom," he said. "I'm okay." And he was okay mostly. But as he lay in bed that night, staring out at the stars through his bedroom window, Rick wondered what it would be like to live in the regular speed world that everyone else inhabited. Would it be lonelier? Simpler? Would feelings feel less intense if you couldn't stretch space around them to give them room to breathe? He flexed his fingers toward the window, and for just a moment he could swear the starlight slowed and thickened, becoming something he could almost touch. But instead of trying to hold on to the sensation, he let it go, the way Grandma Rose had taught him to let go of summer tomatoes and autumn leaves, and all the beautiful things that weren't meant to last forever. Tomorrow, he knew, there would be other playground accidents and failed tests and moments of unexpected kindness. There would be more opportunities to practice this strange gift he was still learning to understand. And maybe, if he was very lucky, there would be other people who could see what Sarah Chen had seen, that there was something different about the way he held space for the world's pain and joy. For now, though he was content to be 9 years old and falling asleep under a sky full of stars that twinkled at exactly the right speed, in a world that was learning to make room for all the feelings it contained, one stretched moment at a time, the peculiar physics of feeling Rick was beginning to understand weren't really so peculiar after all. They were just the universe's way of ensuring that no emotion ever had to exist alone, that there would always be enough space and time for hearts to heal, and that somewhere, somehow, there would always be someone willing to sit with you in the difficult moments until they transformed into something you could carry more easily. And that, Rick thought as sleep began to tug at the edges of his consciousness, seemed like the most important physics of all. Marcus arrived on a Tuesday in February, when Rick was 11, small and red and impossibly fragile in their mother's tired arms. Rick had spent 9 months preparing to be a big brother, reading books about babies, helping paint the nursery a soft yellow that would work for either a boy or a girl, practicing being gentle with his mother's ever-expanding belly. But nothing had prepared him for the actual reality of this tiny person who seemed to exist in a constant state of urgent need. The first few weeks passed in a blur of 3 a.m. feedings and the particular exhaustion that settles over a house when no one is getting more than 2 hours of sleep at a time. Rick's mother moved through their days like a loving ghost, functional but distant, her attention consumed by the mysterious demands of new motherhood. His father, who had always been more comfortable with the theoretical aspects of parenting than the practical ones, threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. Leaving early and returning late with the guilty relief of someone escaping chaos he didn't know how to navigate, which left Rick as the unofficial translator between Marcus and the rest of the world, the interpreter of cries and the guardian of sleep schedules. And it was in this role that Rick first began to understand that his gift extended beyond moments of obvious pain or crisis. It worked just as well with the ordinary, everyday needs that babies couldn't articulate and adults sometimes forgot to notice. Marcus was 3 weeks old the first time Rick felt that familiar warm tug in his chest while holding his brother. It was late afternoon, that grey February time when winter feels endless and spring seems like a rumor you're not sure you believe. Their mother had finally fallen asleep on the couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and their father wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. Marcus had been fussing for the better part of an hour, not quite crying but making the kind of restless, unsettled sounds that meant he was building toward a full meltdown. Rick had been walking him around the living room, bouncing gently the way the baby books recommended, when suddenly the space around them grew soft and elastic. The winter light filtering through the windows took on a golden quality, and Marcus's fussing quieted to curious murmurs as the world settled into that slower, more spacious rhythm that Rick was learning to recognize as his gift in action. But this time, instead of feeling someone else's pain or fear, Rick found himself tuned into something much subtler. Marcus's wordless frustration at being unable to communicate what he needed, his infant confusion at the overwhelming sensory input of simply being alive, his deep, pre-verbal longing for connection and understanding. "Oh," Rick whispered, adjusting his hold on his brother. "You're not hungry or tired or uncomfortable. You're just lonely, aren't you? You want someone to really see you." Marcus blinked up at him with those impossibly dark eyes that all newborns have, and Rick felt a wave of recognition pass between them. In that stretched-out moment, Rick could sense the essential Marcusness of his brother, the personality that was already there, waiting to unfold complex and complete despite being housed in such a tiny body. He was going to be funny, Rick somehow knew. Not class clown funny, but quietly witty, the kind of person who noticed absurd details and made gentle observations that made people laugh without realizing why. He was going to be loyal, almost to a fault, and sensitive in ways that would sometimes hurt him but would also allow him to understand others with remarkable clarity. He would struggle with math but excel at understanding people. He would be brave in small, important ways and kind in the manner of someone who remembered what it felt like to need kindness. "You're going to be okay," Rick told him, and the words carried the weight of prophecy. "More than okay. You're going to be wonderful." As if satisfied by being truly seen, Marcus settled into peaceful quiet, his tiny fist curling around Rick's finger with surprising strength. The moment gently released them back to normal speed. But something had changed between them, a bond that went deeper than ordinary siblinghood, a connection that would shape both their lives in ways Rick was only beginning to imagine. Over the following months, Rick became Marcus's primary interpreter and advocate. When their mother was overwhelmed by the competing demands of work and motherhood, Rick was the one who noticed that Marcus's crying meant he was overstimulated, not hungry. When their father expressed frustration at Marcus's apparent preference for Rick's company, Rick gently explained that babies often bonded most strongly with whoever paid the closest attention to their unspoken needs. "It's not that he doesn't love you, Dad," Rick said one evening as they watched Marcus happily gurgling in Rick's arms while refusing to settle for anyone else. "He just knows I can hear him differently." Their father looked at Rick with an expression caught somewhere between pride and concern. "You're 11 years old, Rick. You shouldn't have to be so responsible all the time." But Rick didn't experience it as responsibility exactly. Taking care of Marcus felt like breathing, or like using his eyes to see, not a burden but simply what those particular parts of him were designed to do. His gift had evolved since those early days on the playground. It was no longer just about stretching space around other people's feelings. It was about creating bridges of understanding between people who couldn't quite reach each other on their own. By the time Marcus was 6 months old, Rick had developed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his brother's needs. He could tell from across the room when Marcus was getting tired, could predict growth spurts by subtle changes in his brother's demeanor, could soothe him through teething pain with a combination of gentle attention and that strange, warm energy that Rick was learning to direct more consciously. Their mother began to rely on Rick's insights in ways that probably weren't entirely fair to an 11-year-old, but Rick didn't mind. There was something deeply satisfying about being needed in such a specific, important way, and Marcus thrived under his care, developing into a remarkably calm and happy baby who seemed to possess an unusual degree of trust in the world around him. "He's so content," their pediatrician observed during Marcus's 9-month checkup. That's relatively rare in babies his age. Usually they're much more anxious about strangers, more clingy with their primary caregivers. "What's your secret?" Rick, who had accompanied them to the appointment, exchanged a quick glance with his mother. "Rick spends a lot of time with him," she said carefully. "They have a special bond." Dr. Santos smiled. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. Marcus is one of the most emotionally secure babies I've seen." On the drive home, Rick's mother was unusually quiet. Finally, as they pulled into their driveway, she turned to look at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Rick, honey, can I ask you something?" "Sure, Mom. When you're with Marcus, do you feel like you understand things about him that other people don't?" Rick considered how to answer. He'd learned to be careful about describing his gift to adults, who tended to either dismiss it as childhood imagination or worry about it in ways that made him feel strange and isolated. "I guess I just pay attention," he said finally. "And he's not that complicated once you figure out his patterns." His mother nodded slowly. "You know, your grandmother Rose used to say something similar about people in general. She said most folks weren't nearly as mysterious as they pretended to be. They just needed someone to really listen to what they were saying underneath all the words." "Do you miss her?" Rick asked softly. "Every day," his mother replied. "But I see her in you sometimes, in the way you notice things other people miss. It's a gift, Rick, but I want you to remember that you're still a kid. It's okay to let other people take care of you sometimes, too." That night, as Rick helped give Marcus his bath, he thought about what his mother had said. It was true that he often felt older than 11, that he'd learned to carry emotional weight that most kids his age never even noticed. But he didn't feel burdened by it exactly. It was more like being born with particularly keen eyesight. Yes, you saw things that others missed, but that didn't make seeing a hardship. Marcus splashed happily in the warm water, and Rick found himself stretching the moment again, creating space for the simple joy of watching his brother discover the properties of bubbles and floating toys. In that expanded time, Rick could feel Marcus's delight as if it were his own. The sensory pleasure of warm water, the fascination with cause and effect, the deep contentment of being loved and cared for. "You're so lucky," Rick told him gently. "You get to grow up knowing someone is always paying attention, always trying to understand what you need. That's not something everyone gets." Marcus looked up at him with those serious dark eyes and made a sound that wasn't quite a word, but felt like agreement. At 9 months old, he was already showing signs of the empathy that Rick had sensed in him from the beginning, reaching for people who looked sad, offering his favorite toys to anyone who seemed upset, crying when other babies cried even if he'd been perfectly content moments before. "You're going to be even better at this than I am," Rick realized with a mixture of pride and something that might have been relief. "You'll understand people, but you'll also understand how to let them take care of you. That's going to be important." As if he understood the significance of this prediction, Marcus reached up and patted Rick's face with one wet, soapy hand, leaving bubbles on his older brother's cheek. It was such a purely loving gesture that Rick felt his eyes fill with unexpected tears. This was what it meant to be someone's keeper, he thought. Not to control or protect them from all difficulty, but to see them clearly, to believe in who they were becoming, and to create enough space in the world for them to grow into their full selves safely. By the time Marcus was walking and starting to form his first real words, Rick had become something of a legend among the neighborhood parents for his ability to calm fussy children and resolve playground disputes with remarkable skill. But Marcus remained his most important project, the person who had taught him that his gift wasn't just about managing crisis moments or soothing acute pain. It was about the daily practice of deep attention, the ongoing work of creating space for another person to exist fully and safely in the world. Years later, when Marcus was old enough to articulate his own memories of early childhood, he would tell people that his older brother had made him feel like the most interesting person in the world. Even when he was too young to have done anything particularly interesting, Rick looked at me like I was already whoever I was going to become, Marcus would say. Like he could see the whole person I'd be someday, and he liked what he saw. But Rick knew it was more than that. In learning to be Marcus's keeper, he discovered that his gift worked both ways. That in creating space for his brother to grow and flourish, he'd also created space for himself to understand what it meant to love someone not for what they could give you, but for who they essentially were. At 11 years old, with a baby brother who trusted him completely, and parents who were learning to trust his insights about their family's emotional needs, Rick was beginning to understand that being different wasn't the same thing as being alone. Some gifts, he realized, were meant to be shared, and the best way to share them was to use them in service of helping other people become more fully themselves. Marcus fell asleep in Rick's arms that night, as he did most nights, and Rick carried him to his crib with the careful attention of someone handling something precious. As he tucked his brother under his soft blue blanket, Rick felt that familiar warm energy settle around them both, like a benediction. "Sweet dreams, little brother," he whispered. "Tomorrow we'll stretch some more moments together." And in his sleep, Marcus smiled, as if he was already dreaming of all the beautiful, expanded time they had ahead of them. 13 arrived like a thunderstorm Rick hadn't seen coming, bringing with it the particular chaos that adolescence visits upon families who thought they had everything figured out. His voice cracked at inopportune moments. His body suddenly seemed assembled from mismatched parts, and worst of all, his gift became unpredictable in ways that left him feeling like a stranger to himself. It started with small things, moments that should have stretched smoothly instead lurched and stuttered like a car with a bad transmission. Conversations that needed extra space to unfold properly would suddenly snap back to normal speed without warning, leaving people confused and Rick frustrated. Even his connection with Marcus, which had been as reliable as sunrise for the past 2 years, began to feel static-filled and uncertain. "Something's wrong with me," Rick confided to Dr. Reyes during his annual physical that spring. Dr. Reyes had been their family physician since Rick was small, and had developed a comfortable way of treating Rick's unusual insights as just another quirk of personality, rather than something that required medical explanation. "Define wrong," Dr. Reyes said gently, his pen poised over Rick's chart. Rick struggled to find words for something he'd never had to explain before. "You know how sometimes you can just tell what someone needs, even if they don't say it? Like my mom needs coffee before she can have a real conversation in the morning, or Marcus needs his stuffed elephant when he's scared." Dr. Reyes nodded. "You've always been exceptionally perceptive about other people's emotional states." "Right. But lately it's like trying to listen to a radio station that keeps fading in and out. Sometimes I can hear people perfectly, and sometimes it's just noise." Dr. Reyes set down his pen and looked at Rick with the kind of attention that made you feel like the most important person in the room. "Rick, you're 13 years old. Your brain is literally rewiring itself right now, forming new connections and pruning old ones. It would be more surprising if everything felt exactly the same as it did when you were 11, But what if it doesn't come back? Rick asked, voicing the fear that had been keeping him awake at night. What if this is just who I am now? Then you'll figure out how to be that person, Dr. Reyes said simply. But I suspect you're not losing anything permanent. You're just learning to use a familiar tool in a more complex world. Rick left the appointment feeling marginally better, but still deeply unsettled. That afternoon, he sat in his usual spot under the oak tree in their backyard, watching Marcus build elaborate sandcastles in the sandbox their father had installed the summer before. At almost 3 years old, Marcus had developed into exactly the kind of child Rick had sensed he would be, funny and sensitive and surprisingly wise for someone who still occasionally forgot to use words instead of pointing when he wanted something. Rick tried to stretch the moment around them, to create that familiar expanded space where he could tune into Marcus's inner world more clearly. For a few seconds it worked. He could feel his brother's focused contentment, the simple pleasure Marcus took in creating something with his own hands. But then the sensation faltered and scattered like a flock of startled birds, leaving Rick sitting in ordinary time with an ordinary view of his brother playing in the sand. Rick sad, Marcus observed, looking up from his castle with those discerning dark eyes that seemed to see more than a 2-year-old should. Rick felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Even without his gift working properly, Marcus could still read him perfectly. Maybe Dr. Reyes was right about learning to use familiar tools in new ways. Yeah, buddy, I'm a little sad, Rick admitted. But it's okay. Sometimes people get sad when they're figuring out how to grow up. Marcus abandoned his sandcastle and toddled over to where Rick was sitting, climbing into his lap with the matter-of-fact affection that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. He didn't try to fix Rick's sadness or distract him from it. He just settled against his brother's chest and began to hum one of the lullabies Rick used to sing to him when he was tiny. And in that moment, Rick realized something important. His gift might be changing, becoming more complex and harder to control. But the love that powered it was still there. The desire to understand and connect and create space for other people's feelings hadn't disappeared. It was just learning to work within the new parameters of his 13-year-old self. Over the following months, Rick developed what he privately thought of as a more manual approach to his abilities. Instead of relying on that automatic warm tug in his chest, he learned to consciously choose when and how to stretch moments. Instead of effortlessly tuning into other people's emotional frequencies, he practiced the more deliberate work of close observation and careful listening. It was harder than it had been when he was younger, but it was also more intentional. He found himself having conversations with classmates who were struggling with their parents' divorce, sitting with neighbors who were dealing with job loss or illness, offering his particular brand of patient attention to anyone who seemed to need it. His English teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, noticed the change in him first. "Rick," she said after class one day, "have you ever considered peer counseling? We have a program here at school for students who are interested in helping their classmates work through problems." Rick had never heard of peer counseling, but something about the idea resonated with him immediately. "What would I have to do?" "There's a training program over the summer," Mrs. Kowalski explained. "You'd learn basic listening skills, conflict resolution, how to recognize when someone needs more help than you can provide. Then during the school year, you'd be available for other students who need someone to talk to." Rick thought about it all the way home, and by dinner he'd made his decision. His parents were surprised but supportive when he asked if he could sign up for the training. "You're sure this is something you want to do?" his mother asked. "It's a big responsibility for someone your age." "I think I'm already doing it," Rick said honestly. This would just make it more official. The peer counseling training that summer was unlike anything Rick had experienced before. For 6 weeks, he and 15 other teenagers learned about active listening, emotional validation, crisis intervention, and the crucial skill of knowing your own limits. Rick discovered that many of the Techniques they were taught felt familiar to him. He'd been instinctively using them for years back, but having formal language for what he was doing made him feel more confident and capable. His trainer, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Chen, who worked as a therapist at the county mental health center, seemed to recognize something unusual in Rick's approach to the work. "You have remarkable intuition for someone your age," she told him after a particularly challenging role-playing exercise. "Have you always been interested in helping people?" "I guess so," Rick said. "It feels like something I'm supposed to do." Dr. Chen studied him with the kind of thoughtful attention Rick was used to giving other people, but rarely received himself. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But remember that taking care of other people is only sustainable if you're also taking care of yourself." Rick nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant in practical terms. Self-care felt like a luxury he couldn't afford when there were so many people around him who needed help. But he filed the advice away for future consideration. When school started in the fall, Rick found himself busier than ever. Word spread quickly that he was someone you could talk to when things got complicated, and his lunch hours were soon filled with classmates who needed someone to listen to their stories about family problems, friendship drama, academic stress, and the general confusion of being 13 in a world that seemed designed for people who had everything figured out. Rick's gift, meanwhile, continued to evolve. He learned that he could still stretch moments when it was really necessary, but now it required conscious effort and left him tired afterward. More often, he found himself relying on what he thought of as the language of unspoken things, the ability to hear what people meant underneath what they were saying, to notice the feelings they couldn't quite articulate, to create space for emotions that were too complex or frightening to address directly. It was during one of these lunch conversations that Rick met Aisha, a quiet 8th grader who had been having panic attacks during math class. She'd been sent to him by the school counselor, who thought peer support might be less intimidating than adult intervention. "I don't know why it happens," Aisha told him, her hands twisted together in her lap. "I'm not even bad at math, but every time Mr. Peterson calls on me, I can't breathe and my heart starts racing and I feel like I'm going to die." Rick listened carefully, both to her words and to the things she wasn't saying. "It sounds really scary," he said finally. "Have you always felt anxious about being called on? Or is this something new?" "It started this year," Aisha said, "right around the time my parents started fighting about whether they were going to get divorced." Rick felt that familiar warm tug in his chest, and he made a conscious choice to create a little extra space around their conversation. The cafeteria noise seemed to fade slightly, and Aisha's breathing began to slow and deepen. "So maybe it's not really about math," Rick suggested gently. "Maybe it's about feeling like you're supposed to have the right answer, when everything in your life feels like a question you don't know how to solve." Aisha's eyes filled with tears. "Yeah," she whispered. "That's exactly what it feels like." They talked for the rest of the lunch period, and by the end of the conversation, Aisha looked lighter somehow, as if she'd been carrying a weight she could finally set down. Rick gave her some breathing exercises he'd learned during his training, and suggested she talk to the school counselor about her parents' situation. "Thank you," Aisha said as they packed up their things. "I feel like you really understand what I was trying to say," Rick smiled. "That's what I'm here for." As he walked to his next class, Rick reflected on how much had changed since he'd first discovered his gift in Grandma Rose's garden. He was 13 now, no longer the little boy who could effortlessly slip into expanded time or automatically tune into other people's emotions. But in losing some of that automatic ability, he'd gained something else, the conscious choice to use his sensitivity in service of others, the deliberate practice of creating space for difficult feelings, the intentional cultivation of understanding. Maybe Dr. Reyes had been right. Maybe he wasn't losing his gift so much as learning to use it in a more complex world. The language of unspoken things, Rick was beginning to understand, wasn't something you were born knowing. It was something you learned through practice, through paying attention, through caring enough about other people to really listen to what they were trying to tell you. That evening, as Rick helped Marcus get ready for bed, his little brother looked up at him with that serious expression that meant he was thinking about something important. Rick helped people, Marcus observed, with the confident authority of a 3-year-old stating an obvious fact. I try to, Rick said, tucking Marcus under his covers. People happy when Rick helps, Marcus continued, but Rick tired sometimes. Rick paused in his tucking, struck by his brother's perception. Yeah, buddy. Sometimes helping people is tiring. Marcus reached up and patted Rick's cheek with one small hand. Rick need help too, he said firmly. Marcus, help Rick. Rick felt his eyes fill with unexpected tears. There it was, the reminder he'd needed, delivered with the clear-eyed wisdom that only small children seem to possess. He'd been so focused on learning to use his gift in service of others that he'd forgotten what Dr. Chen had told him about taking care of himself. Thanks, Marcus, Rick said softly. You do help me. You help me remember what's important. Marcus smiled and closed his eyes, secure in the knowledge that he'd said something that needed saying. And Rick sat beside his brother's bed for a few extra minutes, stretching the moment just slightly, creating space for the simple joy of being loved by someone who saw him clearly and wanted to take care of him in return. At 13, Rick was beginning to understand that the language of unspoken things was a conversation, not a monologue. It required not just the ability to hear what others needed, but the wisdom to recognize and articulate his own needs as well. It was a more complex way of being in the world than he'd known when he was younger, but it was also, he was beginning to suspect, a more sustainable one. The gift was changing, yes, but it was changing in the direction of something deeper and more intentional, something that could grow with him as he became whatever kind of person he was meant to be. And that, Rick thought as he finally turned off Marcus's light and headed to his own room, seemed like exactly the right kind of growth. Rick was 15 when Dr. Elaine Softheart walked into his life, though he wouldn't learn her real name until much later. To him, she was simply Dr. S., the new grief counselor at Riverside Community Center where Rick had started, volunteering after his peer counseling supervisor suggested he might benefit from. Working with more complex cases, Dr. S. was not what Rick had expected when he imagined a professional therapist. She was barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair that always looked slightly windblown, and a tendency to wear cardigans, in colors that had names like Sage and Dusty, Rose. She spoke so quietly that people automatically leaned forward when she talked, and she had a habit of pausing in the middle of sentences as if she were listening to something only she could hear. But there was something about her presence that made the air in any room feel more spacious, more forgiving. Rick noticed it the first time he attended one of her grief support groups for teenagers. Sitting in a circle of folding chairs in the community center's multi-purpose room, while she guided them through conversations about loss that somehow managed to be both heartbreaking and healing. Grief, Dr. S. said during that first session, her voice so soft that Rick found himself holding his breath to catch every word, is not a problem to be solved. It's a landscape to be explored. And like any landscape, it has its own weather, its own seasons, its own hidden paths that only reveal themselves when you're ready to see them. Rick felt that familiar warm tug in his chest, but this time it was different. Instead of the urgent need to stretch a moment around someone else's pain, he felt drawn to simply listen, to let Dr. S.'s words settle into the quiet spaces of his own mind and see what they illuminated there. The thing about grief, she continued, is that it teaches us things we never wanted to learn, but can't unknow once we've learned them. It shows us how much love weighs, how wide the world becomes when someone we care about is no longer in it, how silence can be both empty and full at the same time. Around the circle, Rick could see the other teenagers responding to her words in different ways. Jessica, who had lost her best friend in a car accident, was crying quietly. David, whose father had died of cancer the year before, was nodding as if Dr. S had just articulated something he'd been trying to understand for months. Sarah, whose grandmother had died by suicide, was staring at her hands with an expression that suggested she was hearing something she'd never heard before. Rick, who had never experienced major loss beyond Grandma Rose's slow fade into dementia, found himself thinking about all the small griefs he'd witnessed in other people, the deaths of pets and friendships, the loss of childhood homes and family stability, the quiet mourning that happened when people realized they were growing out of versions of themselves they'd loved. After the session, as Rick helped stack chairs and clean up the room, Dr. S approached him with that peculiar quality of attention he'd learned to recognize in people who saw more than they let on. "You're Rick," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Yes, Mom. I've heard interesting things about you from the other counselors. They say you have unusual insight for someone your age." Rick felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd learned to be wary of adults who commented on his abilities, never sure whether they were impressed or concerned or something more complicated. "I just pay attention," he said. The response he'd perfected over the years. Dr. S smiled, and there was something in her expression that reminded Rick of Grandma Rose, a quality of warmth that suggested she knew more about him than seemed possible given their brief acquaintance. "Would you be interested in helping me with some individual sessions?" she asked. "Not as a counselor. You're not trained for that yet, but as what we might call a presence. Sometimes people need more than one person holding space for their story." Rick wasn't entirely sure what she meant, but something about the offer felt important. "What would I have to do?" "Mostly what you already do," Dr. S said. "Listen, pay attention. Hold still while people figure out what they need to say." Over the following months, Rick found himself spending more and more time at the community center, sitting in on Dr. S's sessions with her permission and the client's consent. He learned that his role was not to offer advice or insight, but simply to be present in that particular way he'd been practicing since childhood, creating space around difficult emotions, making room for feelings that were too big or too complex for ordinary moments to contain. It was during these sessions that Rick began to understand the true scope of human resilience. He sat with parents who were learning to live after losing children, with teenagers navigating the aftermath of trauma, with elderly people facing their own mortality with varying degrees of grace and terror. And in each case, he watched Dr. S work with a kind of gentle precision that seemed almost magical in its effectiveness. She never rushed anyone toward healing or pressed them to feel better before they were ready. Instead, she created what she called containers, safe spaces where people could experience their full range of emotions without fear of judgment or premature comfort. She taught Rick that the most powerful healing often happened not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the accumulation of small moments in which people felt truly seen and understood. "The work we do," Dr. S explained to Rick one afternoon as they walked through the community center's garden after a particularly difficult session, "is not about fixing people. People aren't broken. They're just carrying experiences that are too heavy or too sharp or too strange to carry alone." "So what are we doing then?" Rick asked. "We're being walking companions," she said simply. "We're saying, I see how heavy that load is, and I'm willing to walk beside you while you carry it, for as long as you need me to." Rick thought about this as they continued their walk among the late summer flowers. But don't people want to feel better? Don't they come to therapy to stop hurting? Dr. S paused beside a patch of sunflowers, their faces turned toward the afternoon light. "They come because they're tired of hurting alone," she said. "There's a difference between stopping pain and learning to carry it in company. Pain that's witnessed, pain that's shared, pain that's held by someone who cares, that kind of pain transforms. It doesn't disappear, but it becomes something you can live with. This conversation stayed with Rick throughout his sophomore year of high school. He began to notice how his own gift had always worked along similar principles, not eliminating other people's difficult emotions, but creating space for those emotions to exist without overwhelming the people who felt them. He'd been doing instinctively what Dr. S was teaching him to do consciously, offering the healing power of genuine presence. It was Dr. S who first suggested that Rick might want to consider psychology as a career path. "So you have the temperament for it," she told him during one of their regular debriefing conversations. "And more importantly, you have the calling. I can see it in the way you hold space for people, the way you trust the process even when it's uncomfortable." "But what if I'm not smart enough?" Rick asked. "Psychology seems like something you need to be really academic for." Dr. S laughed, a sound like wind chimes on a gentle breeze. "Rick, I've watched you sit with people in some of the darkest moments of their lives, and I've never once seen you try to make those moments smaller or easier or more convenient. You've never tried to rush someone toward healing because their pain made you uncomfortable. That's not something you learn from textbooks. That's wisdom." By the end of his sophomore year, Rick had made his decision. He would study psychology in college, with the goal of eventually becoming a therapist. But more than that, he would continue learning from Dr. S for as long as she was willing to teach him. "There's something I want to show you," Dr. S said one day in late spring, leading Rick to a part of the community center he'd never seen before. She unlocked a door marked Meditation Room and ushered him into a space that felt immediately different from the rest of the building. The room was small and circular, with windows on all sides that let in soft, diffused light. The walls were painted a color Rick couldn't quite name, something between cream and pale gold, and the only furniture was a collection of comfortable cushions arranged in a loose circle on the carpeted floor. "Here's where I come when I need to remember why I do this work," Dr. S said, settling onto one of the cushions with practiced ease. "And this is where I want to teach you about the most important tool you'll ever have as a healer." Rick sat across from her, curious and slightly nervous. Over the months of working together, Dr. S had taught him countless valuable things, but something about this moment felt different, more formal somehow. "Close your eyes," she said softly, "and tell me what you notice about this room." Rick obeyed, letting his eyes drift shut. Immediately he became aware of things he hadn't noticed before, the way the light seemed to pulse gently even through his closed eyelids, the quality of silence that felt full rather than empty, the sense that the space itself was somehow listening. "It feels calm," he said finally, "like it's holding something." "Good," Dr. S said. "What else?" Rick let his awareness expand, the way he'd learned to do when stretching moments for other people. "It feels like it's been used for important things. Like people have brought their deepest feelings here and the room has absorbed them somehow." "Very good. Now, without opening your eyes, can you feel the edges of the room? Can you sense where the walls are?" Rick concentrated, and to his surprise he could. Not through sight or sound, but through some other sense he didn't have a name for. "Yes," he said. "That," Dr. S said quietly, "is what we call sacred space. It's not about religion or doctrine or any particular belief system. It's about intention. This room has been intentionally set aside for the work of healing, and over time that intention has become part of its essential nature." Rick opened his eyes and looked around the room with new understanding. "And we can create that anywhere?" "With practice, yes. Every time you sit with someone in their pain, every time you choose to hold space for difficult emotions rather than trying to fix or change them, you're creating sacred space. You're saying this moment matters. These feelings deserve to be witnessed. This person deserves to be seen." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, and Rick felt that familiar, warm energy flowing through him, but gentler now, more controlled. He was beginning to understand that his gift wasn't separate from the work Dr. S was teaching him. It was part of it, the intuitive foundation upon which he could build more conscious skills. "Dr. S?" he said finally. "Yes, thank you for teaching me all this, for helping me understand what I want to do with my life." She smiled, and there was something almost maternal in her expression. "Rick, you've been doing this work since you were 7 years old, sitting in your grandmother's garden. I'm just helping you understand what you already know." As Rick walked home that evening, he reflected on how much had changed since he'd first started volunteering at the community center. He was still the same person who could stretch moments and create space for other people's emotions. But now he had language for what he was doing, professional context for his calling, and most importantly, a mentor who understood that some gifts were meant to be cultivated rather than simply used. Dr. S had taught him that healing work was not about having all the answers or being able to fix everyone's problems. It was about being willing to sit with people in their uncertainty, to witness their pain without trying to take it away, to trust that human beings had an innate capacity for growth and healing when they felt safe enough to access it. Most importantly, she had shown him that his unusual sensitivity was not a burden to be managed or a quirk to be tolerated, but a calling to be honored. There were people in the world who needed exactly what he had to offer, and there was profound meaning in learning to offer it skillfully and sustainably. At 15, Rick was beginning to understand that his gift had been preparing him for this work all along. Every playground conflict he'd helped resolve, every difficult conversation he'd navigated with Marcus, every moment he'd stretched to accommodate someone's pain, it had all been practice for something larger and more important than he'd ever imagined. And Dr. S, with her whispered wisdom and her radical faith in the healing power of genuine presence, had helped him see that he wasn't just someone who happened to be good at comforting people. He was someone who had been called to the ancient and essential work of helping human beings find their way back to wholeness, one sacred moment at a time. The letter arrived on a Thursday in October, when Rick was 16, and the world still felt like something that made sense most of the time. It was thin and official-looking, addressed to his mother in the precise typeface that hospitals use when they want to appear both professional and compassionate. Rick found it on the kitchen counter when he got home from school, along with a note from his mother saying she'd had to leave work early and would explain everything when she got back. Marcus, now 4 and possessed of the particular wisdom that comes from being the younger sibling of someone who pays attention to everything, took one look at Rick's face and climbed into his lap without being asked. "Sad letter?" Marcus said, pointing at the envelope Rick was still holding. "I don't know yet," Rick replied honestly, "but it feels sad." They sat together on the couch until their mother returned an hour later, her face carrying the particular expression that adults wear when they're trying to figure out how to translate terrible news into words that won't break the people they love. "Boys," she said, settling into the chair across from them, with the careful movements of someone who had just learned that the world was more fragile than she'd previously understood. "I need to tell you something about Grandma Rose." Rick felt that familiar warm tug in his chest, but this time it was accompanied by something colder and more frightening. He let himself sink into that expanded awareness, creating space around this moment that felt too important and too final to experience at regular speed. Grandma Rose had died peacefully in her sleep at the memory care facility, their mother explained. She'd been declining for months, but the staff had thought they had more time. The funeral would be Saturday. There would be people coming to the house over the next few days, and phone calls to make, and decisions about flowers and music, and all the practical details that death requires of the living. "She's not hurting anymore," their mother said, and Rick could hear the effort it took for her to keep her voice steady. The doctor said it was like she just let go, like she decided it was time. Marcus, who had never known Grandma Rose as anything other than the quiet, confused woman, who sometimes forgot his name but always remembered to smile when she saw him, accepted this news with the matter-of-fact resilience of childhood. Rick, who carried vivid memories of the grandmother who had taught him about gardens and time and the weight of love, felt something crack open inside his chest. But it wasn't until the funeral that Rick truly understood what Dr. S had meant about grief being a landscape to explore. The service was held in the small Methodist church where Grandma Rose had been a member for 30 years, and it was full of people Rick had never met. Her bridge club friends, neighbors from the house she'd lived in before moving in with Rick's family, former students from her years as an elementary school teacher. They all had stories about Grandma Rose that Rick had never heard, versions of his grandmother that existed in other people's memories and would die with them when their time came. During the service, Rick found himself stretching the moment around his family's grief, creating space for his mother's quiet tears and his father's awkward attempts at comfort, and Marcus's whispered questions about why everyone was so sad. But he also found himself tuning into something larger and more complex. The collective mourning of everyone who had loved Grandma Rose in their own way, the communal recognition that something irreplaceable had been lost. It was beautiful and overwhelming, and more complicated than any emotion Rick had ever tried to hold space for. He sat in the front pew with his family, surrounded by flowers and soft organ music, and the particular silence that comes when a room full of people are all thinking about mortality at the same time. And he learned something important about the nature of sorrow. Grief, he realized, wasn't a single feeling. It was a symphony of feelings, sadness and gratitude and regret and love and fear and relief, all woven together in patterns that changed from moment to moment. You couldn't hold it properly if you tried to make it simpler than it was, and you couldn't heal from it if you tried to experience only the easy parts. After the service, people gathered at their house for the kind of subdued social event that follows funerals. Conversations in gentle voices, casseroles that would fill their refrigerator for weeks, stories shared over coffee and cake about the person who was no longer there to hear them. Rick moved through the afternoon like someone learning a new language, practicing the skills Dr. S had taught him on a larger and more personal scale than he'd ever attempted. Before, he found himself gravitating toward people who seemed to be struggling with their own versions of loss. Mrs. Henderson from next door, who kept saying she should have visited more often. Mr. Garcia from the hardware store, who had known Grandma Rose since she was young, and couldn't stop talking about how the town had changed since then. His own father, who was trying so hard to be strong for everyone else that he'd forgotten to let himself feel anything at all. You don't have to be okay right now, Rick told his father quietly as they stood together in the kitchen, away from the crowd of mourners in the living room. His father looked surprised by the directness of the observation. I'm fine, Rick. I need to be fine. Your mother needs me to be fine. Mom needs you to be real, Rick said gently. She's trying to take care of everyone else's feelings about Grandma Rose, but she also needs to know it's okay for her to fall apart if she needs to. Rick could see his father processing this, the way people process ideas that are obviously true but somehow surprising. When did you get so wise about these things? I don't know if it's wisdom, Rick said. I just know that trying to protect people from your feelings usually ends up making them feel more alone with theirs. That evening, after the last of the visitors had gone home and the leftover food had been put away, Rick's parents finally broke down together on the couch, holding each other and crying in the way that people cry when they've been holding back all day. Marcus, who had been unusually clingy since the funeral, fell asleep in Rick's lap while they all sat together in the quiet house, processing the reality that Grandma Rose was really gone. I keep thinking about things I should have asked her, Rick's mother said eventually. Family stories I never bothered to learn, recipes I never wrote down, advice I never thought to request. She knew you loved her, Rick's father said softly. That's what mattered to her. Rick felt that warm, familiar energy flowing through him, and he consciously expanded it to encompass his whole family, creating a pocket of slower, Gentler time where they could sit with their loss without feeling rushed to move past it. "Tell me about her," Rick said quietly. "Tell me about the Grandma Rose I never got to meet." And so they did, trading stories and memories until late into the night. Rick learned about his grandmother's college years, when she'd wanted to be a journalist, but had been told that wasn't a practical career for women. He heard about her first apartment, where she'd lived alone and scandalized her parents by wearing pants to the grocery store. He discovered that she'd been an amateur photographer, that she'd once driven cross-country by herself, that she'd been known for her terrible jokes and her generous heart, and her ability to make anyone feel welcome in her home. She would have been so proud of who you're becoming, Rick's mother told him as they finally prepared to go to bed. She always said you had the kind of heart that made the world bigger just by being in it. Rick remembered her saying those exact words to him that night in the garden, when he was 7, and just beginning to understand that he was different from other children. It felt like a gift, having that memory return to him in the context of everything he'd learned since then about what it meant to hold space for other people's pain. Over the following weeks, Rick found himself thinking often about what he'd experienced at the funeral and in the days that followed. The grief hadn't ended when the service was over, or when the flowers wilted, or when the last casserole was consumed. It had settled into his family's daily life, like a new piece of furniture that they all had to learn to navigate around. But something else had happened too. In learning to hold space for his family's mourning, in practicing the skills Dr. S had taught him on his own most difficult emotions, Rick had discovered something important about the nature of healing. Sorrow held properly didn't disappear, it transformed. It became something you could carry without being crushed by it, something that connected you more deeply to your own capacity for love rather than separating you from it. "How are you doing?" Dr. S asked him during their next session at the community center. "Different," Rick said, surprising himself with the honesty of the answer. "Like I understand something now that I could only guess at before. What do you understand?" Rick thought for a moment, trying to put words to the shift he felt in himself. "That my gift isn't just about helping other people feel better. It's about helping them feel whatever they need to feel completely enough that they can eventually choose what to do with those feelings." Dr. S smiled with what looked like profound satisfaction. "And how does that change how you want to use your gift?" "I think," Rick said slowly, "I want to learn how to help people the way you helped my family get through losing Grandma Rose. Not by trying to take their pain away, but by making it safe for them to feel it fully." "Rick," Dr. S said gently, "I think you already know how to do that. You just needed to experience it yourself to trust it." That afternoon, Rick walked home through the October streets of his neighborhood, past houses where people were dealing with their own versions of loss and love, and the complicated business of being human. He thought about Grandma Rose, who had taught him that some things were worth holding on to and others were worth letting go, and who had somehow known that he would need both skills to become the person he was meant to be. At 16, Rick was beginning to understand that learning to hold sorrow properly wasn't just a useful skill for someone who wanted to help others. It was essential preparation for living a fully engaged life. Sorrow properly held became wisdom. Pain properly witnessed became compassion. Grief properly shared became connection. And all of it, every difficult feeling and complicated moment, could be transformed into something useful for the work of helping other people find their way back to wholeness. Marcus was waiting for him when he got home, armed with a drawing he'd made of their family that included a stick figure labeled Grandma Rose floating among the clouds above their house. "She's watching us," Marcus announced with 4-year-old certainty. "And she's happy because we remember her." Rick looked at the drawing and felt that familiar warm tug in his chest, but this time it was accompanied by something that felt like gratitude. "So yeah, buddy," he said, ruffling Marcus's hair. "I think you're right." That night, Rick dreamed of gardens where nothing ever truly died, where love persisted in the soil long after the flowers had returned to earth. where the careful attention you paid to beauty in its season somehow guaranteed that beauty would return in new forms. When the time was right, he woke up feeling like he had learned to hold sorrow properly at last, not by making it smaller or easier, but by making room for it to exist alongside everything else he carried, including joy. The summer Rick turned 17 was the summer he learned that some conversations can only happen in expanded time, and some truths can only be spoken when the world slows down enough to hold them safely. It started with Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who lived 3 houses down and had been watering her roses at exactly 6:30 every morning for as long as Rick could remember. Rick had been walking Marcus to his summer day camp program when he noticed Mrs. Chen standing motionless in her garden hose in hand, water running uselessly into the flower bed, while she stared at something only she could see. There was something about her stillness that made Rick feel that familiar warm tug in his chest, and without really deciding to, he found himself creating space around the moment. "Marcus," he said quietly to his brother, "wait here for just a minute, okay?" Marcus, now 5 and increasingly aware of Rick's unusual interactions with the world, nodded solemnly and settled himself on the sidewalk to examine a line of ants with the focused attention that summer mornings seemed designed to accommodate. Rick approached Mrs. Chen slowly, the way you approach wild animals, or people who are standing too close to the edge of something dangerous. As he got closer, he could see that her cheeks were wet with tears. She didn't seem to notice she was crying. "Mrs. Chen," he said softly, "are you okay?" She looked at him with the startled expression of someone returning from a very distant place. "Oh, Rick, I didn't see you there." "That's okay," Rick said, settling the expanded moment more firmly around them. In the stretched-out time, he could feel the depth of whatever she was experiencing, a sadness so old and complex that it had become part of her essential landscape, like a river that had carved its channel so deep that it changed the shape of everything around it. "I was just thinking about my daughter," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying the particular tone people use when they're speaking about something they rarely allow themselves to discuss. Today would have been her 40th birthday. Rick had lived on the same street as Mrs. Chen his entire life, and he'd never heard her mention a daughter. "Tell me about her," he said, employing the gentle invitation Dr. S had taught him for moments when people needed permission to speak about things they usually kept private. "Her name was Lily," Mrs. Chen said, and Rick could feel how carefully she held the name, like something precious and fragile. "She died when she was 3 years old, leukemia. That was 37 years ago, but some mornings it feels like it happened yesterday." Rick felt the weight of 37 years of carried grief, and he consciously expanded the space around them even further, making room for sorrow that had been growing quietly in the dark for longer than he'd been alive. "She loved these roses," Mrs. Chen continued, gesturing to the garden that Rick now realized was less a hobby and more a memorial. "She used to help me water them when she was tiny. She'd hold the hose with me and talk to the flowers like they were her friends." "So you water them every morning," Rick said with understanding. "For her." Mrs. Chen nodded and her tears began to fall more freely. "People think you're supposed to get over losing a child. They expect you to move on and find closure, and all those things that people say when they don't know what else to say. But the truth is you don't get over it. You just learn to carry it differently." Rick thought about Grandma Rose's funeral, about the way his family's grief had settled into their daily life rather than disappearing. "What's it like?" he asked quietly. "Carrying it for so long?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for so long that Rick wondered if the question had been too intrusive. But finally she spoke. "It's like having a second shadow," she said. "Most of the time you don't really notice it's there. But sometimes when the light hits just right, you see it clearly and you remember that you're never really walking alone." They stood together in the expanded morning, surrounded by roses that bloomed in memory of a little girl who had loved them. and Rick understood something about the nature of time that he'd never considered before. For Mrs. Chen, this garden existed in multiple temporalities simultaneously. The present moment where she watered flowers in the early morning quiet, the past where a 3-year-old girl helped her tend to beauty, and some timeless space where love persisted beyond the boundaries of ordinary life and death. "Thank you," Mrs. Chen said eventually, "for listening. I don't often talk about her, but sometimes it helps to say her name out loud." "Lily," Rick said gently, and he could feel how the words settled around them like a blessing. Mrs. Chen smiled through her tears. "Yes, Lily." Rick let the moment return to normal speed gradually, the way you ease back into shallow water after diving deep. Marcus looked up from his ant observation with the patient expression of someone who was used to his brother's unusual interactions with the world. "Ready to go?" Rick asked. "Is the flower lady okay?" Marcus whispered as they continued walking toward his day camp. "She's sad," Rick said honestly. "But she's okay. Sometimes people carry sadness for a long time, and that's okay too." Marcus considered this with 5-year-old seriousness. "Like how I still miss Grandma Rose sometimes?" "Exactly like that." This conversation with Mrs. Chen set the tone for what became an extraordinary summer. Word seemed to spread through some invisible network that Rick was someone who could hold space for the kinds of conversations that people usually kept locked away in the private chambers of their hearts. He found himself having impossible conversations with people he'd known his entire life, but had never really known at all. There was Mr. Rodriguez from the corner store, who told Rick about the son he'd given up for adoption when he was 17, and had wondered about every day for the past 40 years. There was Ms. Patterson, his former elementary school teacher, who confided that she'd never married because she'd fallen in love with a woman in an era when that love had to remain secret, and she'd never learned how to love differently. There was Tommy, the kid who used to push people off monkey bars, now 17 himself, and struggling with his father's alcoholism. There was Sarah from the math test conversation years before, now dealing with her parents' messy divorce and her own questions about college and the future. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Rick would notice someone carrying something too heavy for ordinary moments to accommodate. He would create expanded space around their interaction, and somehow in that stretched-out time, people found themselves able to speak. Truths they'd never spoken before. "You're like a walking confessional," his friend Jake observed. One afternoon when Rick mentioned having a deep conversation with their mailman about his struggles with depression. People tell you things they probably don't tell their therapists. Rick had been thinking about this phenomenon himself. "I think," he said slowly, "it's because I don't try to fix anything. I just make room for it to exist." "But doesn't it get heavy?" Jake asked. "Carrying everyone else's secrets?" It was a good question, and Rick found himself thinking about it as he walked home that afternoon. The truth was, it did sometimes feel heavy. But it wasn't the weight of carrying other people's secrets. It was more like the weight of carrying other people's trust. People were trusting him with parts of themselves they usually kept hidden, and that trust felt both precious and fragile. That evening, Rick mentioned his conversation with Jake to Dr. S. during one of their regular check-ins. They'd continued meeting throughout his high school years, and she'd become something like a combination mentor, supervisor, and friend. "Jake raises an important point," Dr. S. said thoughtfully. "When people trust you with their deepest truths, you become responsible for holding those truths carefully. How are you taking care of yourself while you do that work?" Rick had to admit that he hadn't been thinking much about self-care. The conversations felt so important, and the people seemed so grateful to have someone listen to them, that it hadn't occurred to him to consider the impact on his own emotional well-being. "Here's something I want you to try," Dr. S. suggested. "After each of these conversations, take a few minutes to check in with yourself. Notice what feelings the conversation brought up for you, what it reminded you of in your own life, what you might need to process or release before you're ready to hold space for someone else. Rick started implementing this practice, and he discovered that his impossible conversations were affecting him more than he'd realized. Mrs. Chen's story about her daughter had made him think about his own mortality and the mortality of everyone he loved. Mr. Rodriguez's regret about his son had triggered Rick's own fears about making irreversible choices. Each conversation was teaching him something about the human condition that he hadn't been ready to learn, but couldn't unknow once he'd learned it. That's the price of doing this work. Dr. S explained when Rick shared these observations with her. Every time you hold space for someone else's pain, you learn something about pain. Every time you witness someone else's struggle, you become more aware of struggle. It's like becoming fluent in a language you didn't know you needed to speak. But it's worth it, right? Rick asked. I mean, these conversations seem to help people. That's not for me to decide, Dr. S said gently. That's for you to decide. But I will say this. The fact that you're asking the question suggests you're developing the kind of ethical awareness that's essential for anyone who wants to do healing work professionally. As the summer progressed, Rick began to understand that his gift was evolving again. The expanded moments he created weren't just about slowing down time or making space for difficult emotions. They were about creating conditions where people could encounter parts of themselves they usually avoided, where they could speak truths they usually kept silent, where they could be witnessed in their full complexity without fear of judgment or premature advice. The summer of impossible conversations taught Rick that everyone carried secrets, that most people were lonelier than they appeared, and that the simple act of being truly seen could be profoundly healing. It also taught him that he needed to be intentional about caring for himself if he wanted to continue offering this kind of presence to others. On the last day of summer, Rick found himself back in Mrs. Chen's garden, helping her plant bulbs that would bloom the following spring. They worked together in comfortable silence, and Rick felt that familiar warm energy flowing between them, connecting this moment to all the other moments they'd shared over the months. Rick, Mrs. Chen said as they finished planting the last bulb, I want you to know that talking about Lily didn't make me sadder. It made me feel like she was more real somehow. Like she still mattered to someone besides me. She does matter, Rick said simply. She'll always matter. As Rick walked home that evening, he reflected on what he'd learned during his summer of impossible conversations. He'd learned that people were more resilient than they often believed, that love persisted in forms that couldn't always be seen, and that sometimes the most profound healing happened not through dramatic intervention, but through the simple act of bearing witness to someone's truth. He'd also learned that his gift came with responsibilities he was still learning to understand. If he was going to continue developing his ability to hold space for other people's deepest experiences, he needed to be intentional about developing his ability to hold space for his own experiences as well. At 17, Rick was beginning to understand that impossible conversations weren't really impossible at all. They just required the right conditions, enough time, enough space, enough trust, and enough courage to speak and listen to truths that usually remained hidden, and he was learning that creating those conditions might be the most important work he could do with his life. College arrived like a storm. Rick hadn't seen coming, despite 4 years of preparation and a full scholarship to study psychology at the State University, 2 hours from home. Suddenly, he found himself in a dormitory room the size of his childhood closet, surrounded by 18-year-olds who seemed to possess a casual confidence about their place in the world that Rick had never learned to feel. His roommate, Derek, was a business major from Connecticut who brought more electronics than Rick's family owned, and who seemed genuinely baffled by Rick's tendency to have deep conversations with people he'd just met. Dude, you've been here 3 days, and you already know our RA's entire relationship history. and the girl next door struggles with her eating disorder. Derek observed as Rick came back from what was supposed to have been a quick trip to get ice. How does that even happen? Rick had been wondering the same thing. In the close quarters of dormitory life, his sensitivity to other people's emotional states had become almost overwhelming. He could feel his floormates' homesickness like a low-grade fever, could sense their academic anxieties and social insecurities and family tensions radiating through the thin walls like heat from an overworked furnace. Worse, his ability to create expanded time around difficult moments had started activating without his conscious permission. Conversations that should have lasted 5 minutes stretched into hour-long confessional sessions. Study groups turned into impromptu therapy circles. Even casual interactions in the dining hall became opportunities for people to share their deepest fears and most carefully guarded secrets. "I think something's wrong with me," Rick confided to Dr. S during one of their weekly phone sessions. She'd insisted on maintaining their mentoring relationship even after he left for college, understanding that the transition would likely trigger changes in his gift that he'd need guidance to navigate. "Define wrong," she said in her familiar, gentle way. "It's like my filters aren't working," Rick explained, pacing his tiny dorm room while Derek was at class. "I used to be able to choose when to stretch moments, when to tune into people's feelings. Now it just happens automatically, and I can't seem to turn it off." Dr. S said, and Rick could hear the understanding in her voice. "You're experiencing what happens when a sensitive person is suddenly exposed to a much higher concentration of emotional intensity than they're used to. Is that a real thing?" "Think of it like moving from a small town to a big city," Dr. S explained. "In a small town you know everyone's story, and the emotional landscape is relatively stable and familiar. In a big city, you're suddenly exposed to thousands of strangers' stories all at once. Your gift is trying to respond to all of them simultaneously, which is overwhelming your system." Rick felt some of his anxiety ease. Having a framework for understanding what was happening made it feel less like he was losing his mind, and more like he was facing a problem that could be solved. "So what do I do?" he asked. "You learn to manage your sensitivity more consciously," Dr. S said. "The same way people who move to big cities learn to navigate crowds without getting overwhelmed. It's a skill, and like any skill, it improves with practice." Over the following weeks, Rick began experimenting with what Dr. S called emotional boundaries. He practiced noticing when his gift was activating, automatically and consciously choosing whether to lean into the experience or gently redirect his attention elsewhere. He learned to recognize the difference between someone who genuinely needed his particular kind of presence and someone who was simply enjoying having a captive audience for their problems. Most importantly, he learned to create what Dr. S called a recovery time, periods when he intentionally disengaged from other people's emotional states and focused on his own internal landscape. Think of it like physical exercise. Dr. S explained during one of their calls, "If you lifted weights for 12 hours a day without rest, you'd injure yourself. Emotional sensitivity works the same way. You need periods of rest and recovery to maintain your capacity to help others." This was a difficult lesson for Rick to learn. Throughout high school, he defined himself largely through his ability to help other people, and stepping back from that role felt selfish and uncomfortable. But he began to notice that when he was emotionally exhausted from trying to help everyone who crossed his path, the quality of his presence deteriorated. He became impatient with people's problems, resentful of their demands on his attention, and less able to create the kind of healing space that his gift was designed to provide. It was during one of his recovery periods, a quiet Sunday afternoon, when he'd intentionally avoided any emotionally intense conversations, that Rick met Sarah, not Sarah from elementary school, but Sarah Martinez, a sophomore psychology major, who was sitting alone in the library reading what looked like a very dense textbook on trauma therapy. Rick might have walked past her entirely, except that she looked up as he passed and gave him the kind of smile that suggested she'd been hoping someone would notice her sitting there. "Looks like heavy reading," Rick said, nodding toward her book. "The body keeps the score," Sarah said, holding up the cover. "It's about how trauma affects the nervous system. Fascinating stuff, but not exactly light Sunday afternoon material." Rick felt that familiar warm tug in his chest, but this time it was different. Instead of the urgent need to create space around someone's pain, he felt drawn simply to connect with someone who shared his interest in understanding how people healed from difficult experiences. "Psychology major?" he asked. "With a focus on trauma therapy," Sarah confirmed. "What about you?" "Same, actually. Though I'm still figuring out exactly what I want to specialize in." They ended up talking for the rest of the afternoon, and Rick was surprised to discover that he could have a meaningful conversation about psychology and healing work without automatically slipping into the role of counselor or confidant. Sarah was clearly someone who had thought deeply about human suffering and resilience, but she approached these topics from an intellectual and professional perspective rather than a personal crisis that needed immediate attention. "You know what's interesting about you?" Sarah said as they walked back to their respective dorms as the sun was setting. "What?" "You listen like someone who's done a lot of listening. But you also seem like someone who's learned to be careful about when and how you listen." Rick was struck by her perceptiveness. "What makes you say that?" "I've noticed you around campus," Sarah said. "People seem drawn to you, but you're selective about which conversations you engage with fully. That suggests someone who's learned to manage their capacity for emotional engagement consciously." Rick felt a flutter of something that might have been recognition. "You sound like you speak from experience," Sarah smiled. "I grew up in a family where everyone had a lot of problems and not much skill for solving them. I learned early that being the person everyone comes to for help can be both a gift and a trap." This was the beginning of Rick's first real friendship with someone who understood his gift not as something unusual or mysterious, but as a professional skill that required conscious development and careful management. Sarah became his study partner, his sounding board, and eventually his closest friend at college. Through their friendship, Rick learned that he wasn't the only person who possessed unusual sensitivity to other people's emotional states. Sarah had her own version of the gift, an ability to sense when people were carrying trauma, even when they weren't consciously aware of it themselves. Together, they developed strategies for navigating college social life without becoming overwhelmed by everyone else's psychological needs. "The key," Sarah explained one evening as they studied together in the library, "is remembering that having the ability to help people doesn't mean you're obligated to help everyone all the time. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is model healthy boundaries." This perspective was revolutionary for Rick. Throughout his childhood and adolescence, he'd operated from the assumption that his gift came with an obligation to use it whenever someone seemed to need it. The idea that he could choose when and how to offer his particular kind of presence felt both liberating and slightly terrifying. "But what if someone really needs help and I choose not to provide it?" Rick asked. "Then they'll find another way to get help," Sarah said practically. "You're not the only source of healing in the world, Rick. You're one person with a particular set of skills, and you'll be most effective if you use those skills strategically rather than indiscriminately." Over the course of his freshman year, Rick learned to think of his gift less as a supernatural ability and more as a professional capacity that required ongoing development. He studied the psychology of empathy and emotional contagion, learned about the neuroscience of human connection, and began to understand the theoretical frameworks that explained what he'd been doing intuitively for years. This academic understanding of his abilities was both validating and sobering. It was validating to learn that his experiences were consistent with established research about highly sensitive people and their role in social groups. It was sobering to learn about the risks that came with his particular psychological profile. The tendency toward emotional exhaustion, the susceptibility to vicarious trauma, the challenge of maintaining clear boundaries between self and others. The good news, his abnormal psychology professor said during a lecture on empathy and mental health, is that people with high levels of empathic sensitivity can be extraordinarily effective as counselors and therapists, provided they learn to manage their sensitivity consciously, rather than being overwhelmed by it. Rick felt like the professor was speaking directly to him, and after class he found himself approaching her with questions about how to develop empathic abilities professionally. "Have you considered volunteering at the campus counseling center?" Professor Williams suggested. "They have a peer support program that might be a good fit for someone with your interests and apparent natural abilities." This suggestion led Rick to spend the second half of his freshman year training as a peer counselor at the University Counseling Center, where he learned to apply his gift in a more structured and sustainable way. Under professional supervision, he practiced the same kinds of skills Dr. S had taught him, but now with formal protocols for managing his own emotional well-being while helping others. The difference between being someone who's naturally good at helping people and being a professional helper, his supervisor explained, is learning to help people systematically rather than reactively. It's about developing the capacity to turn your sensitivity on and off consciously, rather than being at the mercy of whatever emotional intensity happens to be present in your environment. By the end of his freshman year, Rick had developed a much more sophisticated understanding of his gift and its place in his life. He was still the same person who could stretch moments and create space for difficult emotions, but now he approached these abilities with professional knowledge and intentional boundaries. Most importantly, he'd learned that his gift was most powerful when it was offered consciously and strategically, rather than automatically and indiscriminately. Powers that had sometimes felt like burdens when they operated outside his conscious control became tools for meaningful work when he learned to wield them with purpose and skill. "You seem different," Derek observed toward the end of the semester. "More, I don't know, settled somehow." Rick considered this assessment. "I think I'm learning the difference between being sensitive to other people's feelings and being responsible for other people's feelings. Is there a difference? All the difference in the world?" Rick said with the confidence of someone who had learned an important lesson the hard way. Sensitivity is a gift. Responsibility is a choice. As he packed up his dorm room at the end of his freshman year, Rick reflected on how much had changed since September. He was still someone who could sense other people's emotional needs with unusual clarity, still someone who could create healing space around difficult conversations. But now he understood these abilities as professional capacities rather than mysterious powers, and he'd learned to use them in service of sustainable helping rather than compulsive caregiving. The summer between freshman and sophomore year stretched ahead of him like a bridge between who he'd been and who he was becoming. For the first time in his life, Rick felt like he was growing into his gift rather than being overwhelmed by it, and that, he thought as he loaded his boxes into his father's car for the drive home, felt like exactly the right kind of growth. Her name was Emma Hartwell, and she was sitting alone in the campus coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon in October, reading Virginia Woolf with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was actually enjoying it, rather than just completing an assignment. Rick noticed her first because of the way she held herself, present and engaged with her book, but somehow separate from the ambient anxiety that radiated from most students during midterm season. Rick was in his junior year now, more comfortable with his gift and more intentional about how he used it. He'd learned to navigate campus social life without becoming everyone's unofficial therapist, had developed a small circle of close friends who understood his unusual sensitivity and was beginning to think seriously about graduate school and professional training in psychology. But there was something about Emma that made him curious in a way that felt different from his usual professional interest in people who seemed to be carrying interesting psychological complexity. She looked up from her book as he passed her, their table, and when their eyes met, Rick felt something he'd never experienced before, the sensation that someone was seeing him with the same kind of clarity he usually directed toward others. "Excuse me," Emma said, closing her book but keeping one finger between the pages to mark her place. "This might sound strange, but do you ever feel like you're living in a slightly different speed than everyone else?" Rick stopped walking and looked at her more carefully. "What do you mean?" "I've been watching you," Emma said matter-of-factly. "Not in a creepy way, just noticing. You move through spaces differently than other people, like you're aware of things they're not aware of. And sometimes, when you're talking to someone, it's like the air around the conversation becomes denser somehow." Rick felt a flutter of something between excitement and nervousness. In all his years of having unusual experiences, he'd never met someone who seemed to perceive his gift from the outside. "Do you mind if I sit down?" he asked. Emma gestured to the empty chair across from her. "I was hoping you'd ask." As Rick settled into the chair, he became aware of something unusual. Normally, when he sat down with someone new, his gift automatically began to activate. He'd start tuning into their emotional state, sensing what they might need from the interaction. But with Emma, he felt quiet inside, present and attentive, but not compelled to immediately understand or help or create space around anything in particular. "So," Emma said, "do you want to tell me about whatever it is you do, or should I keep guessing?" Rick laughed, surprising himself. "What makes you think I do anything?" "Because I can see the edges," Emma said simply. "Most people exist pretty solidly in normal time and space, but you're a little bit blurred around the edges, like you're not entirely contained by regular reality." Rick had never heard anyone describe his experience so accurately. "What do you see when you look at the edges?" Emma considered this question seriously. "Possibility," she said finally. "Like you could expand or stretch if you needed to, like you're holding yourself in a smaller shape than you actually are." "And you can see this in other people too?" "Only you," Emma said, "which is why I was curious enough to interrupt your coffee run." They talked for the rest of the afternoon, and Rick discovered that Emma was a philosophy major with a particular interest in phenomenology, the study of experience as it's actually lived, rather than as it's theoretically understood. She was writing her senior thesis on the nature of time perception and had been conducting informal observations of how different people seemed to inhabit temporal experience. "Most people live in what I think of as automatic time," Emma explained. "They're always slightly ahead of themselves, thinking about what comes next, or slightly behind themselves, processing what just happened. But you seem to live in what I'd call conscious time, fully present to whatever moment you're actually in." "Oh," Rick felt understood in a way he'd never experienced before. Emma wasn't seeing his gift as mysterious or supernatural, or even particularly unusual. She was seeing it as a different way of being conscious, a variation in human experience that was interesting rather than strange. "Can I ask you something?" Rick said as the coffee shop began to fill with the evening dinner crowd. "Of course. Do you ever feel lonely? Being able to see things that other people don't see?" Emma smiled, and there was something both sad and knowing in her expression. "Every day," she said. "But I've learned that loneliness isn't always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it's just the price of seeing clearly." This conversation marked the beginning of the most important relationship Rick had formed since his mentorship with Dr. S. Emma became his girlfriend, but more than that, she became his intellectual and emotional companion in ways that Rick hadn't known were possible. Unlike his other relationships, which had often felt like extensions of his helping work, His relationship with Emma felt reciprocal in ways that were both challenging and deeply satisfying. Emma didn't need Rick to stretch moments for her or create space around her emotions. Instead, she offered him something he hadn't realized he was missing: the experience of being truly seen and understood by someone who wasn't looking to him for healing or guidance. "You know what's interesting about being with you?" Emma said one evening, as they walked across campus together after a study session in the library. "What? I've never dated someone who's more emotionally available to strangers than to the people closest to him." Rick felt a flash of defensiveness. "What do you mean?" "Don't get defensive," Emma said gently. "I'm not criticizing you. I'm just observing. You can tune into anyone's emotional state within minutes of meeting them, but you rarely talk about your own feelings unless I ask directly." Rick realized she was right. He'd become so skilled at attending to other people's inner experiences that he'd almost stopped paying attention to his own. "I think," he said slowly, "I might have gotten confused about the difference between being empathetic and being emotionally available." "How so?" "Empathy is about understanding what other people are feeling. Emotional availability is about sharing what you're feeling. I'm really good at the first one, but I've never learned to do the second one." This insight led to one of the most challenging and rewarding aspects of Rick's relationship with Emma. She didn't just accept his emotional reticence as part of his personality. She gently but persistently encouraged him to practice the same kind of vulnerability he created space for in others. "If you want to be really good at helping people," Emma said one night as they sat together in Rick's apartment, "you need to understand what it feels like to be helped. And you can't understand that until you let yourself need help." This was terrifying advice for someone who had defined himself primarily through his capacity to care for others. But Emma was patient and persistent, and gradually Rick learned to share his own struggles and uncertainties with someone who listened, without trying to fix or minimize his experiences. "I worry sometimes that my gift is the only interesting thing about me," Rick confided to Emma one evening after a particularly difficult day at his practicum placement at the campus counseling center. "Why would you worry about that?" Emma asked. "Because what if people only want to be around me because I make them feel better about themselves? What if I'm not actually someone worth knowing for my own sake?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, and Rick felt that familiar warm tug in his chest. The urge to expand the moment, to create space around his vulnerability. But instead of stretching time, he practiced sitting with his discomfort in ordinary temporal reality. "Rick," Emma said finally, "your gift isn't something separate from who you are. It's an expression of who you are. You have that particular sensitivity because you're the kind of person who cares deeply about other people's well-being. The gift flows from your character, not the other way around. But what if my character is just, I don't know, compulsive helpfulness? What if I'm not actually as generous as I appear?" "Then you'd be like most people," Emma said practically. "Mixed motives, complicated psychology, trying to figure out how to be a good person in an ambiguous world. That wouldn't make you less worth knowing. It would make you human." These conversations with Emma taught Rick something crucial about the nature of intimate relationships. He'd always assumed that his unusual sensitivity would make him a better partner, more attuned to his partner's needs, more capable of creating emotional connection. But he discovered that intimate relationships required skills he'd never developed: the ability to be emotionally transparent rather than just emotionally perceptive, the capacity to receive care rather than just provide it, the willingness to be known in his full complexity rather than just appreciated for his helping abilities. "You're learning to let your edges show," Emma observed one afternoon as they studied together in the library. "It's like watching someone slowly come into focus." Rick looked up from his textbook on family therapy. "Is that good or bad?" "It's honest," Emma said. "And honesty is always good, even when it's uncomfortable. By the spring of his junior year, Rick's relationship with Emma had fundamentally changed his understanding of what it meant to use his gift in service of connection rather than just helping. He was still the same person who could create expanded space around difficult conversations, still someone who could sense other people's emotional needs with unusual clarity. But he was also learning to be someone who could share his own needs, express his own feelings, and receive the kind of patient attention he'd been offering others for years. "You seem different lately," Sarah Martinez observed during one of their regular study sessions. "More present somehow." Rick considered this feedback. "I think I'm learning the difference between being helpful and being authentic." "What's the difference?" "Helpful is about what you can do for other people. Authentic is about who you actually are when you're not trying to do anything for anybody." This distinction became increasingly important as Rick prepared for the graduate school application process. He was applying to doctoral programs in clinical psychology, with the goal of eventually becoming a therapist who specialized in working with highly sensitive people and others who possessed unusual emotional capacities. But Emma's influence had helped him understand that his gift would make him most effective as a therapist, not because it allowed him to bypass the ordinary challenges of human connection, but because it could help him engage with those challenges more deeply and skillfully. "The best therapists I've worked with," Rick told Emma one evening as they discussed his graduate school plans, "aren't the ones who have all the answers. They're the ones who can sit with not having answers in a way that makes it safe for other people to sit with not having answers too." "And you think your gift helps with that?" "I think my gift helps me create the conditions where that kind of sitting can happen," Rick said. "But Emma, I think you've taught me that the gift is only useful if the person using it is willing to do their own sitting with uncertainty." As his junior year drew to a close, Rick reflected on how much his understanding of himself and his abilities had evolved since meeting Emma. He was still someone who could stretch moments and create healing space around difficult emotions. But he was also learning to be someone who could tolerate having his own moments stretched by others, who could receive the kind of patient attention he'd been offering since childhood. Emma had seen his edges, and in seeing them clearly, she'd helped him understand that those edges weren't flaws to be hidden, but essential parts of who he was, the places where his ordinary self met his extraordinary capacities, where his human limitations met his unusual gifts. "Thank you," Rick said to Emma one evening as they sat together on the steps of the library, watching the spring sunset paint the campus in shades of golden rose. "For what?" "For seeing me," Rick said simply. "All of me. Not just the parts that help people." Emma smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "That's what love is, isn't it? Seeing someone's edges clearly and deciding they're beautiful." At 21, Rick was beginning to understand that his gift was most powerful when it was offered by someone who was willing to be fully human, complex, vulnerable, and still learning how to navigate the ordinary challenges of connection and intimacy. The girl who saw his edges had helped him understand that those edges weren't something to be managed or overcome, but something to be honored as an essential part of what made him capable of the work he was called to do. Graduate school arrived like a masterclass in controlled drowning. Rick had thought he understood academic pressure from his undergraduate years, but the doctoral program in clinical psychology at the university was a different species of challenge entirely. Between coursework, research responsibilities, clinical training, and comprehensive exams, he found himself stretched thinner than he'd ever been, his gift fluctuating unpredictably under the constant stress. It was during his second-year practicum at the university's community mental health clinic that Rick first encountered the kind of psychological complexity that would define his professional calling. His supervisor, Dr. Maria Santos, specialized in working with what she called the impossible cases, clients whose experiences fell outside the neat categories of diagnostic manuals, who possessed unusual psychological capacities that traditional therapy approaches couldn't quite accommodate. I'm assigning you to work with someone I think you'll find interesting, Dr. Santos told Rick during their weekly supervision meeting. Her name is Rebecca. She's 26, and she's been bounced between therapists for the past 3 years because nobody can quite figure out what to do with her. Rick read through Rebecca's file with growing recognition. She'd been hospitalized twice for what appeared to be psychotic episodes, but the content of her delusions suggested something more complex than typical schizophrenia. She reported being able to sense other people's emotions so intensely that she sometimes couldn't distinguish her own feelings from those of people around her. She experienced what she described as time skips during emotionally intense conversations. She had a history of becoming overwhelmed in crowded places and had developed elaborate strategies for managing what seemed to be extreme emotional sensitivity. She sounds like someone with an unusual gift rather than a mental illness, Rick said carefully, aware that he was venturing into territory that most of his professors would consider unscientific. Dr. Santos smiled. That's exactly why I thought you'd be the right fit for her case. You have a way of seeing people's strengths, even when they're presenting in crisis. Rick's first meeting with Rebecca took place on a Thursday afternoon in February, in one of the small therapy offices on the 3rd floor of the clinic. She was sitting in the client chair when he arrived, a thin woman with prematurely gray hair and eyes that seemed to hold more weight than someone her age should carry. Another new therapist, Rebecca said, without preamble. How long do you think you'll last before you decide I'm too weird for your theoretical frameworks? Rick felt that familiar warm tug in his chest, and without really deciding to, he found himself creating expanded space around their interaction. I'm not interested in fitting you into theoretical frameworks, he said gently. I'm interested in understanding how you experience the world. Rebecca looked surprised by this response. Most therapists want to know about my symptoms, my presenting problems, how my delusional thinking interferes with my functioning. What would you want them to know instead? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, and Rick could feel her testing the space he'd created around their conversation, sensing whether it was safe enough to hold what she really wanted to say. I'd want them to know that the world is much more complex than most people realize, she said finally. That there are layers of reality that most people can't perceive, and that being able to perceive them isn't a disorder, it's just different. Tell me about the layers, Rick said, settling more deeply into the expanded moment, and Rebecca did. She told him about growing up in a family where emotional violence was constant but never acknowledged, where she learned to navigate by reading the subtlest shifts in people's moods and intentions. She described developing what she called psychic survival skills, the ability to sense danger before it became obvious, to predict people's behavior based on emotional cues they weren't even aware they were broadcasting. But nobody taught me how to turn it off, Rebecca said. So by the time I was a teenager, I was picking up everyone's emotions all the time. Their pain, their anger, their fear, it all felt like mine. I couldn't tell where I ended and other people began. Rick listened with the deep recognition of someone hearing his own story told in a different voice. Rebecca's experiences were more extreme than his own, less controlled and more overwhelming, but the essential pattern was familiar. Unusual sensitivity to other people's emotional states, the ability to expand time around intense interactions, the challenge of maintaining clear boundaries between self and others. What happened when you tried to tell people about these experiences? Rick asked. They told me I was having delusions, Rebecca said bitterly. Grandiose thinking. Magical beliefs. They gave me antipsychotic medication that made me feel like I was living underwater. And when I said the medication was making it harder for me to help people, they said that was proof I was delusional. Rick felt a wave of anger on Rebecca's behalf. But the experiences themselves, The sensitivity, the time expansion, the emotional permeability, those didn't go away. No, Rebecca said. The medication just made it harder for me to manage them consciously. Instead of being able to stretch moments when I needed to, everything felt slow and muddy all the time. Instead of being able to choose when to tune into other people's emotions, I was either completely numb or completely overwhelmed. Over the following weeks, Rick worked with Rebecca to develop what they called a gifts and skills approach to her experiences. Instead of pathologizing her unusual capacities, they focused on helping her understand them as natural variations in human psychological functioning that required conscious management, rather than pharmaceutical suppression. Think of it like being born with exceptional musical ability, Rick suggested during one of their sessions. Having perfect pitch isn't a disorder, but it can be overwhelming if you don't learn how to use it consciously. You need training and practice and supportive mentorship to develop it into something that enhances your life, rather than disrupting it. Rebecca was hungry for this kind of framework. For the first time in her adult life, someone was treating her experiences as capabilities that needed development, rather than symptoms that needed elimination. Rick taught her the boundary management techniques he'd learned from Dr. S and refined through his own experience. How to consciously choose when to tune into other people's emotions, how to create recovery time after intense interactions, how to distinguish between helpful sensitivity and compulsive caregiving. Most importantly, he helped her understand that her gift came with both opportunities and responsibilities. She could use her unusual empathic abilities to help people in ways that conventional therapists couldn't, but she needed to learn to do so sustainably, with clear ethical boundaries and adequate self-care. I want to become a therapist, Rebecca told Rick during their 6th session. I want to work with people like me, people whose experiences are too complex for traditional approaches. That's a beautiful goal, Rick said. What would you need to do to make that possible? Working with Rebecca became a crash course in what Rick privately thought of as bridge building. Therapy, helping people who possessed unusual psychological capacities learn to build bridges between their extraordinary experiences and ordinary life circumstances. Instead of trying to eliminate or minimize their gifts, the goal was to help them integrate those gifts into sustainable, meaningful life paths. Rebecca wasn't Rick's only such client. Dr. Santos began referring more and more people to him who didn't fit neatly into diagnostic categories, artists who experienced synesthesia so intensely that it interfered with their daily functioning, highly sensitive children whose parents had been told they had ADHD or autism, adults who reported precognitive dreams or unusual intuitive abilities that they didn't know how to understand or manage. You're developing a subspecialty, Dr. Santos observed during one of their supervision meetings, working with people who have what we might call exceptional psychological capacities. Is that a real thing? Rick asked. Or am I just attracting people who are creative about their symptoms? Dr. Santos laughed. Rick, in my 20 years of doing this work, I've learned that human psychological functioning is far more diverse and complex than our diagnostic manuals suggest. There are people whose minds work in ways that don't fit our standard categories, and they deserve therapists who can meet them where they are rather than trying to force them into boxes that don't fit. This validation from his supervisor gave Rick permission to more consciously develop his approach to working with what he began to think of as gifted and struggling individuals. He started attending workshops on working with highly sensitive people, read research on empathic abilities and their psychological correlates, and began to develop therapeutic interventions specifically designed for people whose primary challenge wasn't mental illness but rather learning to live skillfully with unusual psychological capacities. His work with Rebecca became a model for this approach. Over the course of a year, she moved from being a frequent user of crisis services to someone who was stable enough to begin taking prerequisite courses for graduate school in psychology. She still experienced intense emotional sensitivity and occasional time distortion episodes, but she'd learned to manage these experiences consciously and even to use them strategically in her work with others. "I'm not cured," Rebecca told Rick during one of their final sessions. "But I'm not broken either. I'm just someone who needs to be more intentional about how I engage with the world than most people do." "How does that feel?" Rick asked. "Like I finally have permission to be who I actually am," Rebecca said. "Instead of spending all my energy trying to be normal, I can spend it learning to be exceptional in sustainable ways." Rick's work with Rebecca and other similar clients was transforming his understanding of his own gift and its place in his professional development. He was learning that his unusual sensitivity wasn't just something that made him a more empathetic therapist. It was something that uniquely qualified him to work with a population of people whose needs weren't being met by traditional therapeutic approaches. "You're developing what I'd call a gifts-based model of therapy," Emma observed one evening as Rick described his work to her. They'd maintained their relationship through graduate school, despite the challenges of Rick's intensive training schedule, and Emma had become his most trusted intellectual companion in thinking through the implications of his clinical work. "What do you mean?" "Instead of starting from the assumption that people's problems are deficits to be corrected, you're starting from the assumption that their problems are often gifts that haven't been properly developed or integrated." Rick considered this observation. "I think that's right, but only for certain kinds of problems. I'm not suggesting that all mental illness is really just undeveloped giftedness." "Of course not," Emma said. "But for people like Rebecca, for people like you, people whose primary struggle is learning to live with unusual psychological capacities, a gifts-based approach seems much more helpful than a pathology-based approach." This conversation helped Rick articulate something he'd been intuiting throughout his clinical training, that his gift wasn't just making him a better therapist in general, but was specifically preparing him to work with a particular population of people whose needs weren't being adequately addressed by mainstream mental health services. By the end of his third year in graduate school, Rick had begun to envision a career path that felt both personally meaningful and professionally viable. He would specialize in working with highly sensitive people, empaths and others, whose psychological experiences fell outside conventional categories. He would develop therapeutic approaches that honored people's unusual capacities rather than pathologizing them. He would help build bridges between extraordinary inner experiences and ordinary outer circumstances. "You're not just becoming a therapist," Dr. Santos told him during their final supervision meeting of the academic year. "You're becoming an advocate for a way of understanding human psychological diversity that could transform how we think about mental health treatment." Rick felt the weight and promise of this calling settling around him like a comfortable coat. At 24, he was beginning to understand that his gift had been preparing him not just to help individual people, but to contribute to a broader shift in how society understood and supported people whose minds worked in unusual ways. He was learning to build bridges from broken things, not by fixing what was broken, but by revealing the hidden strength and beauty in what others had dismissed as damaged. And in doing so, he was discovering that some of the most meaningful healing work happened not through traditional therapeutic techniques, but through the simple act of seeing people's struggles as expressions of their gifts, waiting to be properly understood and skillfully developed. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, pulling Rick from the kind of deep sleep that graduate school had taught him to treasure like gold. His phone buzzed against the nightstand with the particular insistence that suggested either emergency or wrong number, and Rick's gift kicked in before he was fully conscious, filling him with a vague sense of urgency that made his chest tight with anxiety he couldn't yet identify. "Rick?" The voice was barely recognizable, hoarse and small and threaded through with the kind of desperation that makes people call near strangers in the middle of the night. "It's Rebecca. I'm sorry to wake you, but I didn't know who else to call." Rick sat up in bed, immediately alert. Rebecca had been doing well in their work together, stable enough that they'd reduced their sessions to every other week and begun talking about termination. This call suggested something had shifted dramatically. "What's happening?" Rick asked, already reaching for the clothes he'd left on his dresser. "I think I made a mistake," Rebecca said, and Rick could hear tears in her voice. "There's this girl, her name is Melissa. She's been coming to the coffee shop where I work, and she always seems so sad. So I started talking to her, trying to help, and—" Rick waited, but Rebecca seemed unable to continue. "Take your time," he said gently, employing the same tone he'd learned to use with clients who were trying to articulate experiences they didn't have adequate words for. "She killed herself," Rebecca whispered. "Last night. Her roommate found her this morning. And Rick, I think it's my fault." Rick felt his gift activate fully, creating expanded space around this moment that was clearly too complex and painful for ordinary time to contain. Even through the phone, he could sense the magnitude of Rebecca's distress. Not just grief, but a crushing sense of responsibility that threatened to undo all the progress she'd made in learning to manage her empathic abilities. "Can you tell me what happened?" Rick asked, pulling on his jeans with one hand while keeping the phone pressed to his ear with the other. "I've been stretching moments with her," Rebecca said. "Like you taught me to do, but more than I should have. She would come in looking so lost, and I would create this space around our conversations where she could talk about her depression, her family problems, her struggles with school. And she seemed to get better when we talked. She seemed more hopeful." Rick was beginning to understand the scope of what had happened. "How long had you been having these conversations with her?" 3 months, Rebecca said. "Maybe 4. She started coming in almost every day, and we would talk for hours. I thought I was helping. I thought I was using my gift the way you taught me to use it." "Rebecca," Rick said carefully, "were you providing therapy to this girl?" "I don't know," Rebecca said, and her voice cracked completely. "I wasn't trying to. I was just being present with her pain, the way you taught me. But she started telling me things she'd never told anyone else. About her childhood, about her suicidal thoughts, about how talking to me was the only thing that made her feel like living was worth it." Rick closed his eyes, feeling the weight of what Rebecca was describing. She had been using her gift, the same gift Rick possessed, the same ability to create healing space around difficult emotions without the professional training, ethical guidelines or support systems that made such work sustainable and safe. "I'm coming over," Rick said. "Don't do anything until I get there, okay?" "Rick, what if I killed her? What if I made her feel like I could fix her, and then when I couldn't, she gave up?" "Rebecca, listen to me," Rick said, already heading for his car keys. "You didn't kill her. Depression killed her. But we need to talk about what happened so you can understand how to carry this without it destroying you." The drive to Rebecca's apartment took 20 minutes through empty streets, and Rick spent the time thinking about the conversation he was about to have. This was the shadow side of their shared gift, the way that creating healing space for others could create unrealistic expectations, unhealthy dependencies, and ultimately, situations where people's lives felt contingent on access to that particular kind of presence. Rick had been worried about this possibility since he'd started working with Rebecca. Teaching someone to use empathic gifts therapeutically was like teaching someone to perform surgery. It required not just natural ability, but extensive training in how to manage the life and death responsibilities that came with that level of influence over others. Psychological well-being. Rebecca answered her door looking like she'd been crying for hours. Her apartment was small and cluttered, filled with the kind of carefully arranged objects that suggested someone who used her physical environment to manage overwhelming emotional input crystals and plants and soft fabrics that created a buffer between her sensitivity and the harsh edges of ordinary life. "Tell me about Melissa," Rick said, settling into the chair across from Rebecca's couch and consciously creating expanded space around their conversation. Rebecca told him about a 19-year-old college sophomore who had been struggling with depression since her parents' divorce 2 years earlier. Melissa had been seeing a counselor at the university, but she'd told Rebecca that those sessions felt too clinical, and that talking to Rebecca was the first time she'd felt truly understood. "She said I was the only person who really listened," Rebecca said. "The only person who could hold space for how much pain she was in without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush her toward feeling better." Rick felt a familiar chill of recognition. These were the exact words clients had used to describe his own therapeutic presence, and he knew from experience how intoxicating it could be to feel like you were the only person who could provide something essential to someone's psychological survival. "How did you feel when she said that?" Rick asked. "Like I had found my purpose," Rebecca admitted. "Like my gift was finally being used for something important." She would light up when she saw me, and she started timing her visits to the coffee shop around my shifts. It felt like I was saving her. And how did it feel to carry that responsibility? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "Terrifying," she said finally. "I started having anxiety dreams about her. I would worry when she didn't come in for a few days. I found myself thinking about her problems, even when I wasn't at work. But I also felt like I couldn't stop, because what if she needed me and I wasn't there?" Rick recognized the classic pattern of what therapists called rescue fantasy, the belief that you are uniquely qualified to save someone from their psychological distress, combined with the terror that they will be lost without your intervention. "Rebecca," Rick said gently, "what happened to Melissa is tragic, and I understand why you're blaming yourself. But I need you to consider the possibility that you were trying to do work you weren't trained for, with someone who needed more help than any one person could provide." "But you taught me that my gift could help people," Rebecca said. "You taught me that creating space around difficult emotions was healing." "I did," Rick acknowledged. "But I also should have been clearer about the difference between offering emotional support and providing therapy. They require different training, different boundaries, and different levels of professional accountability." Over the following hours, Rick helped Rebecca process what had happened with Melissa and begin to understand how her gift could be both powerful and dangerous when used without adequate training and support. They talked about the difference between being a supportive presence in someone's life and being responsible for their psychological well-being. They discussed the warning signs that suggest someone needs professional intervention rather than informal support. Most importantly, Rick helped Rebecca understand that Melissa's death, while tragic, was not her fault. Depression was a complex medical condition that required professional treatment, and no amount of empathic presence, no matter how skillful or well-intentioned, could substitute for proper psychiatric care. "But what if I had done something differently?" Rebecca asked, as the sun was beginning to rise outside her apartment windows. "What if I had encouraged her to see her counselor more regularly, or noticed that she was getting worse instead of better? Then you would have been acting as an untrained therapist rather than a supportive friend," Rick said honestly. "Rebecca, the tragedy here isn't that you failed to save Melissa. The tragedy is that Melissa didn't get the professional help she needed, and that you took on a level of responsibility that no one should carry without proper training and supervision." This conversation with Rebecca became a turning point in Rick's understanding of his own gift and its ethical implications. He realized that he'd been focused so intently on helping people develop their empathic abilities that he'd given insufficient attention to the potential dangers of those abilities when used without proper boundaries and professional context. The weight of other people's dreams, Their hopes for healing, their fantasies of being saved, their projections of magical powers onto people who seemed to understand them better than anyone else ever had, was a burden that required conscious management and professional support to carry safely. Need to stop working with people until I get proper training, Rebecca said as Rick prepared to leave her apartment. I can't risk hurting someone else the way I hurt Melissa. I think that's wise, Rick agreed. But Rebecca, I also think what happened with Melissa shows that you have the capacity to create profound healing connections with people. That's not something to abandon. It's something to develop properly. What do you mean? I mean you should consider applying to graduate school in psychology. Learn to use your gift in a professional context, with proper training and supervision and ethical guidelines. The world needs therapists who can create the kind of healing space you created for Melissa, but it needs them to do it safely and sustainably. Over the following months, Rick worked with Rebecca to process the trauma of Melissa's death and to begin planning a path toward professional training in psychology. It was difficult work, complicated by Rebecca's tendency to blame herself for not having powers she'd never claimed to possess and responsibilities she'd never been trained to handle. But it was also transformative work, both for Rebecca and for Rick's understanding of his own calling. He realized that part of his professional mission needed to be helping people with empathic gifts understand the ethical implications of those gifts, the ways that creating healing space for others could create dependencies and expectations that were ultimately harmful if not managed within proper professional boundaries. You know what I learned from Rebecca's situation? Rick told Emma one evening as they walked through the university botanical gardens together. What? That having a gift for helping people isn't the same thing as being qualified to help them. There's a difference between natural ability and professional competence, and that difference can literally be a matter of life and death. Emma considered this observation. So what does that mean for how you want to use your own gift? It means I need to be much more intentional about developing the professional skills and ethical frameworks that make my gift safe to use, Rick said. And it means I need to help other people with similar gifts understand the same thing. The experience with Rebecca and Melissa's death taught Rick that the weight of other people's dreams was not something to be carried lightly or without proper preparation. People who possessed unusual empathic abilities had a responsibility to develop those abilities within professional contexts that provided adequate training, supervision, and ethical guidance. But it also reinforced Rick's sense that his calling was not just to become a therapist, but to become an advocate for understanding empathic gifts as professional capacities that required conscious development rather than natural talents that could be used intuitively without consequence. At 25, Rick was learning that some dreams were too heavy for any one person to carry alone, and that the most loving thing he could do for people who shared his gift was to help them understand how to share that weight safely and skillfully with others. The morning began with soft rain, the kind that hums rather than falls, brushing its fingers across the earth like it's smoothing the wrinkles of time. Rick awoke early that day, long before the ceremony, long before the vows and the laughter, and sat by the hotel window watching the drizzle turn the city into watercolor. His little brother was getting married. He whispered it to himself, as if it were a spell he had to cast to believe it. Marcus is getting married. It wasn't sadness he felt, not really. It was something older, quieter, something like watching an old movie of your own childhood. You recognize the faces, the voices, but you know you can't step back into that frame. He made tea. The steam lifted in small spirals, vanishing before his eyes. Every little thing seemed meaningful that morning. The warmth of the mug in his hands, the faint sound of traffic outside, the way the clouds parted in slow silver swells. Life, he thought, was always whispering in metaphors. You just had to be still long enough to hear them. When Marcus knocked at his door, Rick smiled. His younger brother, the boy he'd once carried home after scraped knees and late-night fears, now stood in a neatly pressed suit, nervous and glowing all at once. "Do I look all right?" Marcus asked, tugging at his tie. Rick laughed softly. "You look like someone who's about to make the bravest promise a person can make." Marcus grinned, but there was a tremor in it. "You'll stand beside me, right? Just like always?" Rick placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Always." For a moment they stood there, two brothers, grown yet still connected by all the invisible threads of shared years. In that quiet, Rick could almost feel the gravity between them, the unseen physics of love and memory. The wedding took place in a garden that smelled faintly of lilac and damp stone. Candles flickered beneath a wide white canopy, and a slow breeze carried the music of string instruments through the crowd. Rick stood beside his brother as the ceremony began, his heart swelling in rhythms he couldn't quite name. The officiant spoke words about eternity and choice, about the way two lives could intertwine like vines, finding light together. And as Marcus took his vows, trembling, sincere, Rick felt tears gather behind his eyes, not from sadness, but from the deep tenderness of seeing someone you love step fully into their own story. He thought of the boy who used to hide under blankets during storms, who once asked him if love could be measured like distance, or if it stretched forever, like the space between stars. Now that boy stood before him, ring in hand, eyes shining with certainty. Love stretches, Rick thought. It always does. Sometimes gently, sometimes painfully, but it stretches. When the applause rose and the music swelled, Rick found himself smiling through the blur of tears. Later, at the reception, lights strung overhead glimmered like constellations. People laughed and danced, their joy unfolding in gentle waves. Rick sat for a while beneath the canopy, half listening to conversations, half drifting into memory. He could feel the hum of emotions all around, laughter, longing, nostalgia, the quiet ache of people remembering their own beginnings. It was overwhelming the way love filled a room. He spotted Marcus and his new wife, Eliza, moving together through the crowd. Their hands found each other as easily as breath. Rick's chest tightened with something like pride, something like loss. Not the kind that hurts sharply, but the soft ache that comes when you realize someone you've protected no longer needs your shelter. He thought back to their childhood, Marcus chasing fireflies at dusk, his small hands cupped around light that was always trying to escape, and now he was holding a different kind of light. As the night deepened, Rick wandered to the edge of the garden where the laughter grew faint. Beyond the lights, the world was shadow and mist. He breathed in the scent of rain-soaked soil and distant roses. That's when Eliza's grandmother, a small woman with a silver braid and eyes that seemed to remember everything, Edith approached him quietly. "You're Marcus's brother, aren't you?" she said. "Yes, Mom. He speaks of you often." She smiled, gaze softening. "He says you taught him how to see the good in things, even in sorrow." Rick looked down, unsure how to respond. "People like you," she went on. "You feel the world a little deeper than most. It's both a blessing and a burden." He nodded slowly. "It can be heavy sometimes." She touched his arm gently. "Then let others carry a little of it. You've done your part." Her words lingered like incense curling through him. When it was time to give his toast, Rick stood before the gathered guests, heart quiet but steady. The microphone trembled faintly in his hand. He looked at Marcus, his little brother, now a man, and smiled. "When we were children," he began, "Marcus used to ask questions I could never answer. Big ones, about the universe, about love, about why things hurt. And I'd always tell him that maybe we're not supposed to have all the answers. Maybe we're just meant to hold the questions gently." The guests smiled, listening. Rick's voice grew softer. "Today, seeing him here, I think I finally understand one of those questions. Love isn't about never losing or never breaking. It's about building something together, even when you know time will keep moving. It's about the courage to stretch, Not to reach further, but to hold on with care, he paused. So here's to the stretch, the space between joy and loss, where everything beautiful lives. There was silence, then applause, then laughter, then tears, and in that moment, as Marcus raised his glass, Rick felt something loosen inside him. Much later, when the night was nearly over, he found himself sitting alone beneath a string of fading lights. The moon had risen, pale, patient, timeless. The soft hum of celebration had turned to murmurs and yawns. Marcus came over, loosened his tie, and sat beside him. "You okay?" he asked. Rick smiled faintly. "More than okay." They sat without speaking for a long while, the quiet between them deep and safe. "Thank you," Marcus finally said. "For what?" "For holding the world steady when I couldn't." Rick looked at him, truly looked, and saw not his little brother anymore, but a man who had found his place in the universe. "Always," he whispered. The night breeze moved gently through the trees. Somewhere a candle flickered out. Rick closed his eyes, breathing in the tender balance of it all. The joy, the ache, the inevitable passage of time. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't try to hold it all. He simply let it be. There are nights when the world feels like it's leaning in too close, when every sound, every breath, every tremor of emotion from others hums inside you like a current that won't stop. For Rick, that night began with such a hum. He had just finished another long day at the counseling center, the kind of day that pressed its fingerprints into your soul. 3 sessions had run late. 1 client had broken down. Another had gone silent. A third had walked out in anger. He'd done his best to hold them all, to keep their griefs steady, but by evening he could feel his own edges fraying. When he got home, the city was wrapped in drizzle and low fog. Streetlights floated like blurred orbs in the wet night air. He stood at his window again, the same way he had at Marcus's wedding, and thought of how much could change in 2 years. Back then, love had stretched gently. Tonight it felt as if the world itself was pulling him apart. He sat on the edge of his bed, shoulders heavy, head bowed. His gift, the strange empathy that let him feel others so deeply, was both miracle and curse. Most days it was like breathing underwater and still finding light. But tonight it was drowning. He closed his eyes. And it began, and the flood. He could feel the sorrow of the woman from that morning, who had lost her son 3 winters ago, and still visited his empty room each night. He could feel the fear of the young man who confessed he no longer knew who he was without his pain. Even the quiet gratitude of an older client who'd found peace seemed to weigh on him. Every feeling, every vibration of another soul, echoing inside his chest like overlapping songs. It was too much. Rick pressed his palms against his face. He tried to steady his breath, to return to the grounding techniques he taught his clients. Inhale for 4, hold, exhale for 6. But every inhale seemed to draw in more of the world's ache. Every exhale felt too small to release it. He whispered, "Stop!" But the voices didn't stop. They softened into whispers, yes, but the whispers filled him, hundreds of them, all pleading for healing. "You can't save everyone," a part of him said, "but you can't stop feeling them either," another part answered. It was past midnight when he decided to walk. Sometimes movement helped, to let the body do what the mind could not. The streets were nearly empty. Rain tapped against his coat, and the neon reflections wavered in the puddles like lost stars. He walked without destination, guided only by the quiet ache beneath his ribs. Every window he passed seemed to hum with unseen stories. Behind one curtain, a couple argued in low, trembling voices. Behind another, a child cried in sleep. And though he tried not to, Rick felt each one, a fragment of emotion darting through him like sparks. He reached the small park at the edge of town, the same one he used to walk through in college, when his powers first began to stretch beyond what he understood. The benches were wet, the grass slick. He sat down anyway, letting the rain slide through his hair. Lightning flickered somewhere far off, silent and white. "Too far," he whispered. I've stretched too far. He remembered something Dr. Elaine Softheart once told him when he was 17, a truth he had long buried beneath years of helping others. You are not the vessel for every storm. Rick, you are the sky and wide enough to let them pass through. He had believed her then. But tonight he didn't feel like a sky. He felt like the breaking point of a wave. He leaned back, eyes half closed, feeling the night press its pulse against him. It was as if time itself slowed, not in the peaceful way it used to when he was a boy, but in the way that warns of collapse. The air shimmered faintly. He could see it now, the threads of feeling that connected him to others, faint luminous filaments stretching out in every direction. It was beautiful, terrible, infinite. Each thread vibrated, sadness, hope, love, despair, a symphony of lives brushing against his own. Rick tried to pull back, but the threads held tight. The harder he resisted, the tighter they grew, until he felt the weight of hundreds of hearts clinging to him. He cried out softly, not in pain, but in overwhelm. And for a moment the park around him seemed to dissolve into light. He saw faces, his clients, his brother, his parents, Dr. Softheart, the lost child from last week's session, all suspended in that glow. Their emotions rushed through him in waves, too real, too raw. Then something inside him, a quiet, buried voice, whispered, "Let go." And so he did. When Rick opened his eyes, the rain had stopped. Dawn was just beginning to bleed through the clouds, pale gold, hesitant, forgiving. He was still sitting on the bench, soaked and trembling, but lighter somehow. The threads were gone. Or rather, they had loosened. The world no longer pressed against him with unbearable weight. It simply existed, breathing softly beside him. He inhaled, the smell of wet earth, the faint sweetness of morning, and for the first time in months his chest didn't feel full of others. It was full of space. He watched a bird hop along the path, shaking rain from its feathers, and smiled faintly. He realized then that his gift wasn't meant to hold the whole world. It was meant to remind him of connection, not control. He could feel others, yes, but he was never meant to carry them. He whispered into the pale air, "I understand now." The breeze moved through the trees like a sigh. The city began to stir in the distance. Cars, voices, the first quiet rush of a new day. Rick stood, stretching his arms as if testing how much of himself he could safely hold. His limbs felt tired but alive. He looked up at the pale sky, that vast, endless canvas, and thought again of what Elaine had said. You are the sky. For years, he'd tried to be everything for everyone. Tonight, he had learned the gentler wisdom, that sometimes the truest strength lies in not stretching anymore. He turned toward home, water dripping softly from his coat. The sunrise caught on his face, turning it gold. Somewhere deep inside, he could still feel the echoes of all those he had helped, but now they shimmered like distant stars, beautiful but no longer heavy. He whispered, almost like a prayer, "I'll keep the light, not the weight." And with that, he walked back through the waking city, quieter, softer, yet somehow more whole than he had ever been. There is a quiet that follows exhaustion, a silence so deep it hums. Rick had been living inside that silence for months after the night he stretched too far. The world had softened around him, yet inside everything still trembled like the echo of a struck bell. He took a leave from work. The counseling office, with its soft lamps and steady voices, felt too close to the ache he was trying to understand. His days became slow and unstructured. Morning tea, long walks, sitting by the window watching light move across the walls. At first he mistook stillness for peace. But stillness, he discovered, can also be a mirror, and what it reflected back wasn't simple. Beneath the quiet, he could feel an ache not of others but of himself. He hadn't realized how long he'd been carrying it, years of other people's grief layered like sediment over his own. He thought of his childhood again, The strange awareness, the way he'd felt time bend and stretch when he was 7. Back then, he'd believed the world's sorrows passed through him because he was meant to fix them. Now, at 31, he began to wonder if he was meant only to witness them, to hold them gently, then let them go. But learning to let go is not a single act. It is a practice, slow, tremulous, and full of small surrenders. He found a therapist named June Alden, a woman in her late 50s with a voice like rain on linen. Her office smelled faintly of cedar and mint. The first time Rick sat across from her, he noticed how she didn't fill the silence. She waited, like someone listening for the roots of a sound instead of its surface. When he finally spoke, the words came unevenly, as if they had been waiting years to breathe. "I think I've been carrying too much of other people," he said. "And when I try to set them down, it feels like I'm letting them fall." June nodded. "Empathy can blur boundaries. You love deeply, Rick, but love is not measured by weight. It's measured by presence." Her words settled into him like small stones dropped into water, rippling outward. Over the next weeks, their sessions unfolded in slow, reflective rhythms. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes he cried without knowing why. June taught him to name the small truths of his day. "What did you feel this morning? Where did it live in your body? What happens when you breathe through it?" It was strange being on the other side of the couch, learning to be held instead of holding. He realized how long it had been since he'd allowed anyone to care for him without guilt. One afternoon, she said something that would stay with him for years. "Healing isn't about losing your sensitivity. It's about teaching it where home is." Rick began journaling again, not about clients or stories, but sensations. The way light shifted in the afternoons, the sound of wind through eucalyptus, the smell of the ocean when he visited his brother's house by the shore. Each entry was a kind of reclaiming, a soft way of saying, "I am still here." Sometimes, Marcus would call, his voice bright through the line. He'd tell Rick about Eliza, about work, about the baby they were planning to have. Rick would listen, smiling, feeling pride thread gently through him. He didn't tell his brother everything. Not yet. Some things needed more time to ripen into words. But when Marcus said, "You sound calmer," Rick only replied, "I think I'm learning how to breathe again." Months passed. Seasons slipped quietly by. Rick's world became smaller in size but deeper in meaning. He found beauty in ordinary rituals, folding laundry with mindfulness, cooking simple meals, tending to the small garden on his balcony. He planted lavender one morning, pressing each seed into the soil with his thumb. "For peace," he murmured. That same evening he dreamed of his grandmother's garden, the one where he had first learned to stretch time as a boy. In the dream, everything shimmered softly, and she stood there smiling, her hands muddy from planting. "You were never broken," she said. "You just forgot where your roots were." He woke with tears on his cheeks and the scent of lavender still lingering in the air. In therapy, he began to talk about holding and releasing. "How do you let go without feeling like you've abandoned someone?" he asked. June smiled gently. "You don't let go of them. You let go with them. Every goodbye, every healing is mutual." That evening he sat by the window as dusk gathered. The world outside was quiet. The soft hum of distant cars, a lone bird crossing the fading sky. He thought of all the people whose pain had passed through him, their stories, their faces, their trembling hope. He whispered to the air, "You can rest now." It felt like lighting 1,000 small candles in the dark, each one flickering with peace. By winter, Rick had returned to work part-time. But this time he approached it differently. He no longer tried to fix every ache. He simply offered presence, a calm space, a gentle question, a quiet nod. He started noticing something miraculous. When he didn't try to carry others, they began to carry themselves. And sometimes that was the deepest healing of all. One afternoon, after a session with a young woman who'd just lost her mother, Rick sat alone in his office. The room smelled faintly of rain and tea. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting lines across his desk. He realized that for the first time he didn't feel drained. He felt full, not of pain, but of stillness. He remembered June's words again, "Teach your sensitivity where home is." And he thought, maybe home wasn't a place at all. Maybe it was this quiet balance, this tender ability to feel deeply without breaking. That evening Rick visited the sea. The sky was bruised with color, purples, deep blues, hints of rose. The tide moved in slow breaths, each wave folding over itself like forgiveness. He walked to the edge of the water, removed his shoes and let the cold surf touch his feet. For years, he had believed healing meant becoming unbreakable. Now he understood it meant becoming soft again, soft enough to bend with the tides and not lose your shape. He stood there for a long time, letting the wind thread through his hair, the salt kiss his skin. The horizon shimmered, endless, patient, familiar. "Let go," he whispered to the sea, and somewhere deep inside, something answered back, not in words but in feeling you already have. Rick smiled. The waves came and went. The world exhaled, and within him, space opened wide and quiet, the kind of peace that doesn't end, only deepens. By 33, Rick had grown into his work like an old tree into soil, steady, rooted, giving shade to others. His practice had become known not for brilliance or novelty, but for gentleness. People came because they said he made silence feel safe, but even gentleness has limits. Even the softest hearts can bruise. It was winter when the case came, a small boy named Samuel. He was 9. Bright eyes, dark curls, and a sadness too old for his years. His mother brought him in on a Tuesday afternoon, her hands trembling as she filled the intake form. "Nightmares," she said softly. "He wakes up crying, says he can't breathe." His father passed last year. "It hasn't stopped since." Rick knelt to meet the boy's gaze. "Hey, Samuel, you like stories?" The boy nodded once. "Good," Rick smiled, "because that's how we'll start. With stories." For weeks they met every Thursday after school. The first few sessions were quiet. Rick mostly spoke, Samuel mostly listened. He'd bring little wooden toys to the table and build towers from blocks as Rick talked about stars, oceans, or how feelings are like weather, passing, never permanent. Sometimes Samuel would draw. He'd fill whole pages with swirling dark shapes and small circles of light. When Rick asked what they were, Samuel said, "It's when it gets loud inside me. But the circles are the quiet parts." Rick kept those drawings carefully, knowing how honesty often hides in color and motion before it learns to speak. Bit by bit, the boy began to talk. Not much, but enough. About missing his father, about the sound of footsteps in the hall that weren't there, about how his mother cried in the kitchen when she thought he was asleep. Rick listened. He always listened. One day Samuel said, "Do you ever miss someone so much it feels like you swallowed the sky?" Rick paused. "Yes, and sometimes it stays inside you for a long time. But if you wait, one day it starts to make light instead of weight." The boy seemed to think about that for a long time. Then he whispered, "I want that." Rick nodded. "You will." Winter deepened. The city turned quiet under low gray clouds. Rick found himself thinking of Samuel often, even outside of sessions, wondering if he was sleeping, if the nightmares were fading. He reminded himself not to carry, only to care. But empathy has its own gravity. Then one morning the call came. Samuel's mother, her voice broken, barely holding together. There had been an accident, a sudden one. A car, ice on the road, no chance to stop. The boy hadn't made it. For a moment Rick said nothing. The world went hollow around him. Every sound pulled inward. He murmured something, but comfort, condolence. But the words felt thin, weightless. When the call ended, he sat there at his desk, staring at the small wooden toy Samuel had left behind the week before. It was a half-finished boat. A tiny sail made of paper, edges torn. He traced its surface with his thumb, his chest tightening. The air in the room felt too still, too clean. He whispered, "You were supposed to see the light." That night, Rick walked to the ocean, the same place he had gone 2 years earlier, during his healing. The waves were rougher now, wind churning white foam across the dark surface. He stood barefoot in the cold sand, the water biting at his ankles, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly lost. "Why give someone a gift," he murmured to the sea, "if they never get to use it?" His voice trembled, but the waves answered only with rhythm. Crash, hush, crash. He remembered what June had once told him. Letting go doesn't mean it doesn't matter. But this felt different. This wasn't just letting go. This was losing something sacred before it had the chance to bloom. Tears came, slow and quiet. He didn't fight them. The wind caught his breath and scattered it into the night. For a moment, he imagined Samuel running along the shoreline, laughter echoing, footprints vanishing into the tide. He closed his eyes and saw the boy's drawings, the swirls of darkness, the circles of light. Maybe, he thought, that's where Samuel was now, in the quiet parts. Weeks passed, but the ache stayed. Rick returned to work, but his sessions felt different, heavier, more fragile. He found himself staring at the empty chair where Samuel once sat. During one session, a client said something simple, something ordinary. "I'm scared I won't get better." And for the first time, Rick didn't rush to comfort. He just said softly, "Me too sometimes." That honesty, that human smallness, and it opened something. The client nodded, and in that moment there was no healer and no broken one. Only two souls, sitting quietly with fear. It was then Rick realized maybe healing doesn't mean saving. Maybe it means staying. He couldn't save Samuel, but he could stay. In compassion, in remembrance, in the gentle act of continuing to show up for others. One night as he closed his office, he noticed the little wooden boat still on the shelf. The paper sail had curled from time, the wood pale from dust. He thought about putting it away, but instead he picked it up and carried it outside. The sky was bruised blue, the air sharp with salt. He walked to the nearby river, the same one that wound toward the sea. Holding the toy lightly, he whispered, "Thank you for reminding me what light means." He placed the boat on the water's edge. The current caught it, spinning it slowly before carrying it away. It bobbed once, twice, then disappeared into the moving dark. Rick stood there, hands still, heart steady. Something inside him shifted, not healed, not closed, but softened. He realized grief is not something you fix. It's something you learn to live alongside. Like a quiet friend who stays until the end of your days, he whispered into the wind. "Good night, Samuel." The word carried farther than he expected, disappearing into the quiet hum of the world. Later that week, Rick told June about the moment by the river. She smiled, eyes gentle. "You didn't let go of him," she said. "You let go with him." He nodded slowly, understanding at last. When he left her office, the sun was setting low over the horizon. The light pooled across the street in gold puddles. Rick walked home slowly, feeling the warmth on his face, the steady rhythm of his breath. For the first time since Samuel's passing, he didn't feel haunted by loss. He felt accompanied by it, as if grief itself had reached out, taken his hand, and walked beside him. He thought of all those who would come after, the ones he would sit with, listen to, guide. He wouldn't promise them that pain disappears, only that it can be held gently, kindly, without shame, and perhaps one day it might even sing. By the time Rick turned 35, life had quieted into something gentler, slower, not empty but spacious. He had stopped chasing the horizon of being healed. He had stopped trying to outrun pain. Instead, he began to see that the path forward was not about distance, but about depth, about the tender places where light still flickered even after loss. After Samuel's passing, the old counseling office had begun to feel too small, too haunted by echoes. Rick would walk the hallway, and feel the ghosts of old conversations lingering like dust motes in sunlight. He realized he didn't want to work under fluorescent lights anymore. He wanted something alive, something breathing. So he left. He sold his apartment, packed his books, his notebooks full of dreams, and the few plants that had survived his forgetful watering. Then, one early spring morning, he drove toward the coast, to a small town where the air always smelled faintly of sea salt and pine. He found a cottage there, faded blue paint, wide porch, a window that faced the sunrise. The moment he stepped inside, he felt something open in his chest. It wasn't perfect. The floorboards creaked, and the wallpaper peeled at the edges. But it felt kind. This, he thought, is a place that can hold softness. He spent months restoring it, not rushing, just moving with the rhythm of the days. He sanded wood, painted walls the color of early morning fog, and filled the shelves with books on healing, art, and the mysteries of the heart. Every evening, he lit a candle by the window, a small flame to remind himself that light doesn't have to be loud to be strong. When the place was ready, he hung a simple wooden sign outside, "The Lighthouse Practice." Below it, in smaller letters, he carved the words "For those who carry too much light." He smiled when he finished it. The phrase wasn't from any poem or book. It had simply come to him one quiet night, like the sea speaking through fog. His first client arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday. A middle-aged man, shoulders bent from years of guilt. Rick welcomed him with tea and silence. He didn't take notes. He didn't ask questions right away. He just listened, the kind of listening that doesn't try to fix, only to understand. The man spoke haltingly at first, then more freely, his words spilling like rainwater from a clogged gutter. When he finally stopped, he whispered, "Do you think people can start over?" Rick looked at him with calm eyes. "I think people don't end as easily as they think they do." The man nodded, tears in his eyes, as if someone had finally said something he'd been waiting years to hear. Word spread slowly, not through ads or websites, but through whispers, letters, a quiet reputation. People came from nearby towns, some walking the winding coastal road just to sit for an hour in the cottage by the sea. Rick never promised miracles. He only offered presence. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes, when the pain in others brushed too close to his own, he would remember June's voice. "Teach your sensitivity where home is." And he would breathe. Let it pass through. No longer the vessel for every storm, just the sky again. He still thought of Samuel. He kept one of the boy's drawings, and the last one, framed on his desk. A swirl of darkness with a small golden circle in the center. Underneath, in crooked handwriting, the words "For the quiet parts." Some nights, when the ocean wind pressed against the windows and the waves sighed against the shore, Rick would look at that drawing and whisper, "We're still finding the quiet parts, little one, and maybe somewhere in whatever realm holds tender souls." Samuel heard him. Life moved gently. Marcus and Eliza had their first child, a daughter named Lucy, born under a full moon. When Rick held her for the first time, she looked at him with calm, curious eyes, as if she recognized him. "Uncle Rick," Marcus said with a grin. "You're her favorite already." Rick smiled, feeling warmth bloom through him. "She's got your heartbeat," he said softly. "Strong but kind." He'd forgotten how small beginnings felt, how hope could fit in your hands. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Rick sat by Lucy's cradle and watched her breathing. Tiny, perfect inhales, the rhythm of a world still learning itself. He whispered a promise, not to protect her from pain, but to teach her how to live with it gently. As the months passed, Rick began teaching small workshops at his cottage, gatherings of therapists, teachers, and caregivers who wanted to learn how to hold space without losing themselves. They would sit in a circle on woven mats, candles flickering between them. Sometimes they would meditate. Sometimes they would cry. Rick would speak softly about the balance between empathy and exhaustion, between holding on and letting go. He would say, "We can't take people suffering from them, but we can show them it's survivable." And then he would pause, always pausing, because silence too teaches. One evening after a session, a young therapist stayed behind. She said, "You speak like someone who's lived through 1,000 goodbyes." Rick smiled faintly. Maybe that's what it takes to recognize peace when it finally stays. Every morning, he walked along the cliffs by the sea. The wind played with his hair, gulls circled overhead, and the world felt wide again. He had learned to find comfort not in perfection, but in rhythm, the inhale and exhale of tides, of people, of time. He thought often of the phrase that had once haunted him, stretching too far. Now he understood that the real miracle was not stretching endlessly, but knowing when to rest, when to gather yourself, when to let the world unfold without you holding its corners. He no longer felt the constant hum of others inside him. The gift was still there, yes, but it had softened, become like the tide itself, flowing and returning, never stagnant, never forced. He was finally living with it, not under it. One night, as he closed the practice, he stood by the window. The sea beyond was calm, the moon casting a silver road across the waves. He thought of all the faces he'd seen over the years, those who healed, those who didn't, those who simply came to rest a while in the quiet. He realized then that purpose doesn't always arrive with fanfare or clarity. Sometimes it's born in the smallest gestures, the cup of tea offered, the listening without judgment, the candle lit for a stranger's sorrow. He placed his hand on the window pane, feeling the faint coolness of the glass. The reflection looked older, yes, but gentler too. "I think I've found it," he whispered. "Not the meaning of everything, just the softness within it." Outside, the waves rolled in steady rhythm. The wind carried the faint scent of lavender from his garden, and as he turned off the lights, the little sign outside caught the moonlight, the lighthouse practice, shining quietly against the night. By the time Rick turned 40, his days had begun to take on a rhythm as steady and kind as the ocean itself. The lighthouse practice had grown, not into something grand, but into something alive. Every room held a whisper, a memory, a soft pulse of healing that never demanded attention but always offered it. He had filled the walls with art from patients who'd found their way through darkness. Watercolors of rivers, sketches of stars, poems scribbled on scraps of paper. Every one of them told the same story, that people, when given gentleness, find their own way back to light. That had become Rick's quiet mission, to teach others not to fix but to witness. It began simply. A few younger therapists started coming to him for guidance, curious, burnt out, or just lost between theory and empathy. They called him Dr. Rick sometimes, though he preferred when they didn't. Titles, he thought, made things sound like they had to be solved. They would gather in the sunroom on weekends, where the sea could be heard breathing through the open windows. The light came in golden and warm, dust floating in lazy motion, the kind of silence that holds stories. Rick never lectured. He told them moments instead, fragments of a life spent learning how to hold others without losing himself. He told them about the woman who couldn't forgive herself for surviving, about the boy who only spoke in colors, about the man who never said a word for 3 months, then one day whispered, "I think I'm ready to breathe again." He didn't tell these stories to teach methods. He told them because they were real, and reality, he believed, was the only teacher worth trusting. Once a student named Ava asked, "How do you know when you've truly helped someone?" Rick smiled, eyes drifting toward the window. "You don't," he said. "Not always. Sometimes you only plant a kindness you'll never see bloom, but that doesn't make it any less real." Ava wrote that down slowly, as if she wanted to remember not just the words, but the space between them. Over time, his group grew. Therapists, teachers, nurses, artists, anyone drawn to the quiet art of listening came. They sat in circles, cups of tea in their hands, notebooks half open but mostly forgotten. Rick taught them how to breathe through others' pain, how to leave room for silence, how to recognize when empathy had become exhaustion. "Don't mistake someone's tears for a problem," he would say. "Sometimes tears are how the soul rinses itself clean." They would sit together for long moments after that, the sea wind passing through the screens, carrying the faint scent of lavender and salt, but not all lessons came easily. Some days he saw too much of his younger self in them, the hunger to help, the guilt of not being able to save everyone, the quiet fear that maybe their empathy was a curse. He remembered his own breaking point, years ago, that night when he'd stretched too far, trying to hold a world too heavy for one heart. And now, watching these new souls step into the same fragile work, he felt both pride and worry. He started giving them a simple exercise, one that seemed ordinary but held deep meaning. "Before each session," he said, "light a candle. Not for the person you're helping, for yourself. So that even when you walk into someone's storm, you remember where your own flame lives." It became a ritual. The students began bringing small candles to the cottage, lighting them before their practice sessions. The room would fill with tiny golden lights flickering gently, a constellation of soft purpose, and each time Rick saw them, his heart swelled. This was what he had been searching for all along, not to heal the world, but to teach others how to be healers without losing their tenderness. There was one student, in particular, who stayed after every class. Her name was Mira, quiet, sharp-eyed, always listening just a little deeper than the rest. One evening after the others had gone, she asked him, "Why do you still do this after all these years? You've given so much of yourself away." Rick paused, considering. The twilight painted soft gold lines across his face. "Because," he said gently, "it's the only thing that still feels honest." He smiled faintly. "I used to think healing meant light, bright, radiant, undeniable. But now I know. Healing is just learning to see in the dimness, to recognize that even the smallest glow is enough to keep walking." Mira nodded slowly, eyes glistening. She didn't speak after that. She didn't need to. As the seasons turned, the mentorship became a kind of family. They celebrated small victories, a difficult client breakthrough, a moment of peace after a long week. They shared meals cooked together, laughter echoing through the little seaside home. Sometimes, Rick would catch himself standing at the edge of it all, watching the younger ones laugh, teach, comfort each other, and he'd feel something like awe. He had become, unknowingly, the kind of mentor he once needed. Dr. Elaine Softheart's words would sometimes drift through his mind, "Hold space for others until they can hold it for themselves." He finally understood what she'd meant. On the evening of his 40th birthday, they surprised him. When he entered the sunroom, the lights were dimmed. The table was covered with candles and a cake that someone had baked too lovingly to look perfect. The students stood together, smiling. "We wanted to thank you," Ava said, "for showing us the gentle magic." Rick laughed softly, his eyes misting. "Magic?" he echoed. "Yes," Mira said. "The kind that doesn't need to be seen to change everything." For a long time he didn't speak. He looked around, at the faces illuminated by candlelight, at the little signs of care everywhere, and felt that familiar ache of gratitude that borders on tears. He thought of all the years that had led here, the losses, the lessons, the moments of near breaking, and realized that every single one had been guiding him toward this, the quiet legacy of teaching others to see what the world often overlooks. When everyone had gone, and the last candle flickered low, Rick stepped outside. The night was calm, the sky vast and star-soaked. The sea whispered below, eternal, patient. He tilted his head back, feeling the cool wind on his skin, and whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, just to life, to time, to the invisible threads that had somehow woven pain into peace. And somewhere in the distance, a lighthouse beam swept across the waves, slow, steady, kind, reminding him that even in darkness, there was always something guiding, something gently waiting to be seen. By 45, Rick had learned that peace does not arrive all at once. It gathers slowly, like tide water filling the cracks of old stone, like morning light returning to a familiar room. He lived quietly now, still by the sea, still surrounded by the scent of pine and lavender. The lighthouse practice had settled into a gentle rhythm of its own. Some weeks were full of visitors seeking calm. Other weeks passed, with only the sound of wind against the windows. Rick didn't mind either. He had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness. One healed, the other only whispered of absence. And through it all, Marcus's family had become a steady warmth in his life. Laughter spilling through phone calls, visits full of small hands tugging at his sleeves, and questions asked with the fierce curiosity of children. Marcus and Eliza had two now. Lucy, 10, thoughtful and endlessly imaginative, and Jonah, 6, whose energy was a small hurricane of love and noise. They called him Uncle Rick, though sometimes Lucy, in her playful moods, called him the time stretcher, after hearing one of Marcus's bedtime stories. It had started as a joke, Marcus telling his kids that Uncle Rick could stretch moments so that good things lasted longer. But Lucy took it seriously. "Can you really do that?" she asked once, eyes wide with wonder. Rick smiled. "Maybe not the way you think," he said softly. "But sometimes when you're really in a moment, when you notice how the air smells, how someone's laughter sounds, you make it last forever, at least inside you." Lucy thought about that for a long time. Then she nodded, as if it made perfect sense. The summers became a ritual of sorts, Marcus's family visiting for a week at the cottage, bringing color and noise into Rick's otherwise quiet life. He would cook breakfast early, and Lucy would sit at the counter, drawing pictures while Jonah ran through the hallways, pretending to be an astronaut. The walls filled with laughter again, and that bright, humankind that doesn't need words. In the evenings, they'd walk down to the shore, all four of them, Marcus carrying Jonah on his shoulders, Eliza collecting seashells, Rick and Lucy walking a few steps behind, their shoes sinking softly into wet sand. Lucy always asked the best questions, the kind adults forget to ask. "Do stars ever get lonely? What does silence sound like when no one's around to hear it? Do people stop missing someone when they're happy again?" Rick never gave her simple answers. "Maybe stars are never lonely," he said once, "because they can see each other, even across millions of miles." And Lucy smiled like she understood something deeper than words. One afternoon, when Marcus and Eliza went into town, Rick stayed behind with the kids. The sun was high and golden, the air humming with cicadas. They built a fort in the living room, blankets draped over chairs, pillows piled high. Lucy declared it a listening cave, where no one could speak unless it was about dreams. Inside the soft glow of flashlight light, Rick asked, "So, what do you dream about?" Jonah grinned. "Flying," he said, "and pancakes that never end." Lucy was quiet for a while before she answered, "I dream about people I don't know. Sometimes I think they're real." Rick felt something tender stir in him, that old awareness, the quiet pulse of emotion that lived between souls. He had once dreamed like that too. "Maybe dreams are how we remember things from before we were born," he said softly. Lucy's eyes widened. "Like old stories we used to live?" "Exactly," Rick said. "And sometimes we meet them again, in people, in moments, in the way something feels familiar for no reason." Lucy leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "You talk like dreams are real," he smiled. "Maybe they are. Maybe everything that feels kind is real." That night, after the kids had fallen asleep in their fort, Rick sat by the window. Outside, the moon shimmered across the sea, and he thought about Marcus, about how far they'd come since the days of scraped knees and small arguments. Since those fragile years when everything felt uncertain, Marcus had grown into a man of balance, sturdy, patient, a father who knew when to listen and when to laugh. And watching him with his children, Rick saw the quiet legacy of love repeating itself. not through grand gestures but through small, steady acts of care. He remembered their own childhood, the night he'd stood guard at the door while Marcus slept through a storm, terrified of thunder. And now, decades later, he saw Marcus doing the same, sitting beside Lucy when she had nightmares, holding Jonah until his tears quieted. It was a strange kind of beauty, to see that circle complete itself. As the family prepared to leave at the end of summer, Lucy ran back up the path toward the cottage, clutching a drawing in her hand. "It's for you," she said breathlessly. Rick unfolded it carefully. It was a picture of the sea at night, the moon stretching a silver road across the waves. In the corner, she had drawn a small cottage with warm light spilling from its windows. Above it, in careful looping letters, she had written, "The lighthouse never sleeps." Rick felt his throat tighten. He knelt, meeting her eyes. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "But what does it mean?" Lucy smiled. "You said once that light doesn't have to be loud to be strong. I think your house knows that." He laughed, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Maybe it does." As she hugged him goodbye, he whispered, "You're going to see the gentle magic one day, too." "Lucy." "I already do," she murmured against his shoulder. That evening, after the sound of their car had faded into the distance, Rick sat on the porch and watched the horizon. The world felt both full and quiet, that tender ache of love mixed with absence. He realized that every chapter of his life had been a lesson in continuing. Childhood grief healing, mentoring, all of it looping, returning in softer forms. Marcus's children were the proof that kindness never ends. It just changes hands. He thought of his grandmother's garden where time had once stretched for the first time, of Dr. Elaine's calm eyes, of Samuel's drawing of the quiet parts, and now Lucy's little picture, another link in the chain. The circle was continuing, and maybe that was what all of this had been about. Not escaping the cycles, but learning to love the way they return. He watched the moon rise higher, a silver lantern suspended above the sea. The air carried the faintest echo of children's laughter, a memory maybe, or something more. Rick smiled. "The lighthouse never sleeps," he whispered to himself. And somewhere deep inside a quiet light glowed, patient, eternal, gentle. By 50, Rick had begun to see time differently. Not as something to chase or measure, but as something to rest inside of. It moved like the sea beyond his window, never rushing, never still, always returning to the same shore in new forms. The lighthouse practice had become more than a space for others. It had become a reflection of himself, quiet, resilient, weathered, but filled with light in unexpected corners. The wooden floors had worn soft beneath the years of footsteps that had crossed them. The air always smelled faintly of salt, old books and candle wax. He didn't take as many clients now. Instead, he spent mornings by the sea, afternoons writing letters to former students, and evenings in the garden, tending to lavender that grew wild but beautiful. Like forgiveness left untamed, there was a gentleness to life now, a softness he had once thought was only meant for others. He had kept every letter, every note, every thank you from people who had once found shelter in his practice. Some were long and trembling with gratitude. Others were simple, just a word or a drawing, or a folded scrap of paper with a single line, "I can breathe again." Sometimes, on quiet nights, he would unfold one at random and let the words rest in his hands like small living things. He never reread them to feed pride, only to remember that what we give quietly can still echo loudly in someone else's life. Marcus visited often, now streaked with grey around the temples, his laughter deeper but still familiar. They sat on the porch in the late afternoons, mugs of tea warming their hands, watching the sky shift colours, rose to amber to the deep blue of memory. Marcus would talk about the children, Lucy's new fascination with astronomy, Jonah's obsession with building tree houses. Rick would listen, smiling, heart swelling with quiet joy. Once Marcus said, "You know you've become part of their stories now. When they talk about you, It's never as just their uncle. You're the one who makes time feel slower, the one who teaches them to see beauty in the pauses. Rick chuckled softly. Then maybe that's the only kind of magic worth having. Marcus smiled, eyes kind. You taught me that too, you know. They didn't speak much after that. They didn't need to. The silence between them had grown rich with understanding, the kind of silence only years of brotherhood can create. One evening, while the light stretched golden across the floorboards, Rick found an old photograph. It was from their childhood, two boys sitting beneath a summer sky, their grandmother's garden behind them. He was holding a small clock, the one he'd used that night he first learned to stretch time. The sight made him laugh softly, then ache a little. He remembered how infinite the world had felt back then, how he believed every second could be bent, shaped, or made to linger. Now 50 years into his life, he understood that maybe it could, not through magic but through attention, through love. He placed the photo by the window where the evening sun could touch it each day. In those years, more students began to visit, no longer as learners, but as friends. They brought stories of their own clients, their own lessons, their own quiet triumphs. Each of them carried a little piece of what he had once taught, reshaped by their own lives. It was strange and beautiful to see his words living in other people's voices. The gentle magic, he realized, had never been his to keep. It was meant to pass through him, not stay. He thought often of Dr. Elaine's soft heart, the mentor who had once told him that empathy, when held properly, could become a doorway to peace. He imagined her somewhere, smiling at how far her lessons had traveled, through him, through his students, through those they helped in turn. One rainy afternoon, Lucy came to visit alone. She was 15 now, taller, quieter, with the same thoughtful eyes she'd always had. They sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the rain bead against the glass. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "At school they asked us to write about the person who's changed how we see the world. I wrote about you." Rick smiled, heart stirring. "Oh, what did you say?" She shrugged shyly. "I said you taught me that silence isn't empty, and that kindness can be loud even when no one hears it." For a long time Rick couldn't speak. The rain filled the quiet for him. He reached out, taking her hand gently. "You see it," he whispered. "You really see it?" Lucy smiled. "You said the lighthouse never sleeps, remember?" "I think you were talking about yourself." He laughed softly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Maybe, or maybe I was talking about love." That evening, after Lucy had gone, the world felt tender in its stillness. The sun dipped low, painting everything with the same golden light he remembered from his youth, the color that made even ordinary moments sacred. He stepped outside, walking slowly along the path to the cliffs. The sea stretched endlessly before him, the horizon melting into light. He thought about the decades behind him, every face, every loss, every lesson. It struck him that memory was not a collection of moments, but a single long breath, sometimes calm, sometimes ragged, always moving, and he felt grateful, deeply, quietly grateful. That night he wrote in his journal, a habit he had never abandoned. "At 50, I no longer wish for new answers. I only wish to live my questions slowly. I've learned that peace isn't an ending. It's a rhythm, and love, when practiced gently, becomes its own kind of time travel. It stretches us toward what matters, until we finally recognize that everything was always enough." He closed the book, placed it on the table beside a lit candle, and watched the flame dance softly. Outside, the world exhaled, the sea whispering its endless lullaby, the stars steady in their quiet brilliance. Rick leaned back in his chair, feeling the warmth of the candlelight on his face. His reflection in the window was older now, yes, but serene, the lines around his eyes shaped by both laughter and grief, the kind of lines that tell a full story. He whispered into the stillness, "Thank you for letting me see the evening light on everything." And for the first time he felt not the weight of passing years, but the gentle glow of a life well lived, illuminated from within, soft as dusk, endless as tide. The years had thinned themselves into quiet ease. At 55, Rick no longer counted time in days or months. He measured it by light, the first soft blue of dawn, the gold that filled his window at noon, and the silver hush of night that came like an old friend to sit beside him. The lighthouse had become less a place and more a pulse, something that lived within him now, even when he walked far from its walls. He still tended to it, still lit candles in the windows, though fewer travelers came these days. But that felt right. The world, he thought, should never depend on one lamp alone. He had done what he came here to do, to hold space for others until they could hold it for themselves. Mornings began slowly now. He would rise before the sun, wrap himself in an old shawl and walk barefoot through the dew toward the cliffs. The sea was always waiting, eternal, vast, a mirror of breath itself. Sometimes he would whisper to it. Not prayers exactly, but small acknowledgments. Gratitude for the waves, the light, the sky that changed yet stayed faithful in its rhythm. He had stopped asking why years ago. The need to explain, to untangle, had fallen away like mist. In its place had grown something quieter, something far stronger. Trust. Trust that everything, in its own slow unfolding, had meaning. The lighthouse garden had grown wild over the years, just as he'd hoped. Lavender tangled with ivy. Mint drifted along the path, and small yellow daisies bloomed where no one had planted them. He'd often joked to visitors that the garden had stopped needing him long ago. It simply lived now, the way kindness lives when left unforced. He would sit among the flowers, reading old journals, hearing the hum of bees move like a slow heartbeat through the air. Every sound felt sacred. Sometimes a thought would rise unbidden. How strange, how beautiful, that peace doesn't come when life becomes easy. It comes when we stop needing it to be. Letters still arrived, though not as often. Some from former students who now taught others across the seas. Some from strangers who had read his writings, thanking him for words that had reached them like light through fog. He answered each one, slowly, with ink that sometimes smudged because he refused to rush. Each reply began the same way. The world doesn't ask for perfection, only presence. That had become his quiet teaching, the single thread running through everything he'd ever offered. One autumn evening, Marcus visited again. The air was cool, the horizon washed in amber and smoke. They shared soup, bread, and long pauses that spoke more than conversation ever could. Marcus's hair was white now, his movements slower, but his laughter, when it came, was still the same, whole, unguarded, alive. They sat on the porch until the stars began to bloom above them. Rick said, "You ever think about how strange it is that we spent half our lives trying to figure out what it all means, and the other half just learning to sit still and enjoy it?" Marcus smiled. "Maybe that's the meaning." Rick nodded softly. "Maybe it is." They fell quiet again. Two silhouettes framed by starlight. Brothers not just by blood, but by the long, shared journey of finding gentleness in an unkind world. That winter, Rick began to write again. Not for books or students, but for himself. The words came slowly, like water finding its path through stone. He called it Stretching into Tomorrow. Not a memoir, not exactly, more a conversation with time itself. He wrote about the art of slowing down, about the gift of staying curious, about the way grief could turn to wisdom if held tenderly enough. Each page felt like a window opening, letting the wind move freely through him. In one passage he wrote, "Tomorrow is not a place ahead of us, but within us. We stretch into it every time we choose kindness over hurry, wonder over certainty, love over fear. To live well is not to chase the horizon, but to rest in its reflection and know we are already part of it." When he finished writing, he didn't publish it. He simply left it on the table by the window, where the morning light could find it. He wanted the sea to read it first. As the years turned quietly, the lighthouse became home not just to travelers but to memories. Its walls seemed to hum faintly with stories, Laughter, tears, voices carried by the wind. And when Rick walked its corridors at dusk, he sometimes felt as if he was walking through time itself, every moment he'd ever lived shimmering gently around him. He often lit the last candle at night and whispered, "For whoever needs this light next." Then he would smile and blow it out, trusting the glow would linger where it was meant to. One morning Lucy returned. She was grown now, a teacher herself, her eyes carrying both youth and depth. She brought her own daughter, a little girl with wind-tossed hair and the same curious gaze Rick had once seen in her mother. "Uncle Rick," Lucy said. "She wanted to see the lighthouse." Rick knelt, smiling softly. "Do you know why we light candles here?" The little girl shook her head. "So that even the dark can rest easy," he said. Lucy's eyes glistened. "I still tell my students what you taught me, about silence and time and how every kindness ripples out like a tide." Rick smiled, voice quiet. "Then it was never mine alone, was it? It belongs to you now, to her, to whoever comes next." He placed a small candle in the child's hands. "When you light this, remember, you're part of something that never ends." The girl nodded solemnly as if she understood perfectly. That night, Rick stood by the sea once more. The moon was full, the air cool and clear. The waves moved in steady rhythm, a breath as old as the world. He closed his eyes, feeling the pulse of it. The same pulse that had carried him through 55 years of questions, losses, loves, and quiet awakenings. There was no need for grand conclusions. Only this stillness, only this knowing, that he had lived enough, given enough, been enough. He whispered softly to the wind, "Thank you for letting me stretch into tomorrow." And for the first time he understood what peace truly meant. Not an end but an expansion. Not silence but a deeper song beneath it. The sea answered with a hush that could have been a lullaby. Somewhere far out on the horizon, dawn began to touch the sky. Rick smiled. And the world, gentle, infinite, forgiving, she smiled quietly back.